Right. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. And on behalf of the Duke-Margolis Center and the FDA, I'd like to welcome you to today's public workshop on establishing a high-quality real-world data ecosystem. We're very glad that you're joining us today. I think many of you were with us yesterday as well. This is day 2 of our workshop. And before moving into today's agenda, I'd like to spend a few minutes with a recap on yesterday's discussion. As we heard from our colleagues yesterday at FDA and people from a wide range of perspectives working on the real-world data ecosystem, the development of robust real-world evidence hinges on the availability of data that are fit for purpose. And that means data that are high quality enough for regulatory and other intended uses. And so we focus a lot on what it will take to capture and develop high quality data. We heard from several stakeholders that technology and standard solutions are needed, but this is more than just a technology problem. We heard that developing this ecosystem will require communities of engaged stakeholders aligning around some common goals and some practical use cases, some practical ways where we can see a path to value from taking these steps to capture and develop high quality data. So we considered the current state of data collection for some promising real-world data sources and uses. And while there has been much progress, there are still some very important gaps. There are certainly some limitations to electronic data capture systems, but a more fundamental change that we talked about was the need to rethink and reimagine clinical care and the interactions of doctors, patients, and other key stakeholders who are involved in the data collection process at the point of care. We heard about efforts underway such as OneSource and iCare that are aimed at converging these workflows with the clinical data enterprise. Simply put, the data and outcomes that guide medical product development should not differ from the data we routinely collect as part of care delivery. That's a path to reducing the cost and increasing the availability of potentially useful information for the real-world evidence development. It's also a path for making sure that clinicians and the patients and others working with them have the best data or most reliable data possible for the clinical care that they're providing. Those kinds of synergies are a big part of the future of the real-world evidence enterprise and the real-world data ecosystem. Dr. Amy Abernathy touched on this idea and also the idea that as a community, we need to identify common research questions in order to align our data capture practices across real-world data sources. That's getting those practical applications, those key research questions, motivating the steps to make progress in developing this ecosystem. And as we continue to find convergence among the research questions and the data capture workflows, there will be opportunities to take stock of and to apply lessons learned as we branch out and build the data ecosystem. Yesterday, we focused mainly on initiatives in the oncology space. And today, we're going to take a step further to consider ecosystem development in a range of other therapeutic areas. Ultimately, though, success depends on our ability to scale the use of tools, data standards, and workflows in a way that reduces the burden on providers, ideally that helps them get evidence they can use, and thus produces a meaningful value proposition to all stakeholders, including those involved in the delivery of clinical care. We're going to discuss some of the promising technical tools and solutions that are beginning to emerge, solutions that hold great promise to unlock this value, to make it possible to execute on these research questions and valuable use cases. But as we know, promise and possibilities can only go so far without a plan to promote the adoption and consistent use of the tools. Yesterday, we started talking about opportunities to align payment around the collection of high quality data, and we're going to continue talking about this topic as well today, along with other investments that are being made in data infrastructure to underpin this emerging ecosystem. So as you can tell, while we covered a lot yesterday, we've got a lot to discuss today to build on yesterday's part of the workshop. Now, before we get started, I wanted to quickly review and reiterate some of the virtual workshop logistic considerations and housekeeping. I think we may have a slide for this on workshop logistics. During today's virtual workshop, we're going to invite groups of speakers to provide remarks and engage in discussions in each session. We're also going to have an opportunity for addressing any questions that you have or comments that you have that arise during those sessions as time allows. So to submit a question, please email us, margolisevents@duke.edu, and we'll address those questions to the extent we can get to them. A recording of the workshop is going to be made available on the Duke Margolis website after the event. Because we are recording, we want to remind all of our speakers to please check that your camera and microphones are active before you start talking. And of course, if your microphone's off, we'll give you a reminder about that too. If you encounter any difficulty activating the microphone before you speak, please let our production partner know. We can remotely activate you. The chat box can help with that. We can also deactivate the microphone on your behalf if you're having troubles. We've developed an annotated agenda that has additional background for today's discussion topics that you can review on our event page as well. And we encourage you to engage and react on Twitter regarding today's workshop. The hashtag is RWD Ecosystem. That's RWD Ecosystem, all one word. And you might also consider mentioning our account, which is @DukeMargolis. So RWD Ecosystem is the topic for Twitter, and @DukeMargolis connects it with our account. We invite you to follow along with the Duke Margolis Twitter account and join the conversation online as well. So our first session is on translating early successes of core data element programs to therapeutic areas beyond oncology. And in this session, we want to build on what we know about oncology. We talked about that yesterday, and discuss data collection in a few other therapeutic areas. We're going to begin this session with two presentations. First, we're going to hear from Leslie Harold, who's Chief Scientific Officer at Corona LLC, followed by Chaya Shadra, who's Vice President of Product Data and Informatics at Verana Health. Next, we're going to hear remarks for reaction to these presentations from Patrick Ryan, Vice President for Observational Health Data Analytics at Janssen Research and Development, and Assistant Professor Adjunct at the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. We'll also hear reactions from Paul Friedman, Professor of Medicine and Chair of the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Mayo Clinic, and Peter DeVault, who's Vice President for Interoperability and Genomics at Epic Systems. And I'm going to ask each of our speakers to make their brief remarks following our presentation, and then we're going to move on to some discussion time. So I'd like to start off by asking Dr. Leslie Harold to begin with her comments. Leslie?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to present today on behalf of Corona. Next slide, please. Next slide. So Corona was founded in 2001 by an academic rheumatologist. And in fact, he had a lot of the same issues that were brought up yesterday. He was a clinical trialist. He wanted to identify what was the best drug for his patients. And there was not a systematic approach to gathering this information from providers and from a network, and there was no compensation for that. So he founded a Corona with colleagues, and in fact, Corona is an acronym, and it stands for Consortium of Rheumatology Researchers of North America. We then expanded outside the rheumatology space and partnered with advocacy groups, for example, the National Psoriasis Foundation for our psoriasis registry, and the National MS Society for the MS registry. Next slide. So how do we collect our regulatory grade real world data? Next slide. Yeah, so we use clinical research forms that we ask patients and providers to fill out on a regular basis. And they include covariates and variables and outcomes that would not necessarily be documented at every visit. And we have a standard definition. So for example, as a rheumatologist, I may see a patient and say, patient doing well or patient flaring. But for the registry, you're asked to do a 28 tender and swollen joint count so that we can actually measure validated disease activity measures and follow that in a longitudinal fashion. We also ask providers to gather and ask for safety information at every single visit, and then of course provide documentation that would supplement it for case validation and processing. We do have a pharmacovigilance team that works with all that data to assess safety. Next slide. Next. Perfect. So how do we do this? We engage with sites, and the sites then consent their patients to be part of the registry. We ask the provider to fill out a form, we ask the patient to fill out a form, and if there are any safety issues, we ask for follow-up information to do that. And we pay them. We pay patients and providers to fill out this information. Typically, it's about every 6 months that we gather this information. Next slide. So this is our quality management approach, and it begins with the sites. So we have a close relationship with the sites. We design the questionnaire to make their workflow easy so that it makes sense to them, that it enables high quality data capture. We select sites that can do the things that we need them to do. We train them in our methodology. When they start enrolling patients, we monitor how they do, making sure that things are done accurately. And then there's a long-term monitoring approach that is done. For the data capture, we have an EDC system that blocks out of range values, that makes sure that things are filled out. And then when we compile all the information, there are routine site performance reports that go back to the site to tell them how they're doing. And then based on the analytic database, we run reports to do checks. So for example, if you're a 95-year-old female, you can't report a pregnancy. But I think the key for all of these steps here is that we have an ongoing relationship with the site. So if there are any findings that seem unexpected or off, we can then query the site to get follow-up information to ensure that we have that high quality data. Next slide. Next slide. So this is just the RA registry. We have similar slides for all the other registries that we do. The rheumatoid arthritis registry is our most mature registry. It was our first one. You can see we have over 800 participating rheumatologists. We're in 42 states. Both academic and private practice sites are engaged. And our immediate follow-up time is about 4.5 years for our RA patients. Next slide. Great. So we ask both patients and providers for information. From the patients, we're looking at demographics and lifestyle characteristics. We're also asking about those patient-reported outcomes. We want to know their experience. For the physician-reported information, we want to know about their lifetime use of anti-rheumatic drugs. So if they're a new patient, that's easy. They're newly diagnosed. You can just put that information in as time goes on. But if they have established disease, we ask them to go back to their medical record or go back to the referring provider or transferring provider to look at that. We also ask for disease characteristics and disease activity measures. Once again, something that is standardized and captured that may not be in the medical record. We ask for lab values and radiographs if they're available. And then once again, safety events as they occur. Next slide. So how do we afford to pay patients and providers to gather this information for us? Well, we have subscriptions where pharma companies can come, can ask a question of the data. We do not give out our data, but we then run analyses. And the vast majority of work that we do is for the public domain. So you can see between abstracts and manuscripts, we have over 600 publications. We have comparative effectiveness, comparative safety, and that's really sort of our bread and butter. Next slide, please. So we know in observational cohorts, patients are not randomly assigned one drug versus another. that physicians are very good at identifying who should get what medication. And so we make a point of really understanding those factors, and disease activity and line of therapy are critical to that understanding. So the first pane here is looking at cumulative disease activity, and the ovals here are based on the disease activity and the risk of these cardiovascular events, so major adverse cardiovascular events. And you can see for all three models here that if you're in the black oval remission, you have a much lower risk of having an event than if you're in a high disease activity or higher levels of disease activity. And that's for all three models. And the last model, model C, is adjusted for age, gender, cardiovascular risk factors, as well as RA therapies. We have a similar situation in the second pane, which is about line of therapy. So here is an example within one drug class. So it's the TNFs. They're all the same mechanism of action. And there was a drug that was later to market, and it was being compared to drugs that were earlier to market. And on first blush, you might think that there's a safety signal for infection with a IRR of 1.53. But when you adjusted for how the medications were being used, that signal went away. And that's because the later in market drug was being used later in the line of therapy. So typically, if it's your first drug, you do very well. But if it's your fourth or fifth drug, you're more likely to have less effectiveness and safety issues. And so these are the important points and factors to key in when we start doing analyses. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So our data has been used for both regulatory safety analyses as well as how medications should be used. We do post-approval safety studies, as well as informing medications. So for example, new formulation approval, secondary indications, label extensions, etc. Next slide. Yeah, so this is work that we had done with Pfizer for their drug tofacitinib. We compared it to biologic DMARDs as the comparator, and we evaluated the safety using two different methodologies, three different outcomes, and this was presented at the European Rheumatology meeting. Next slide. Now this is work showing if you comparing two drugs, this is your first biologic, should we choose one drug versus another? If it's your second, should you switch mechanism of action? And that helped inform how medications are used by the European regulators. Next slide. Yeah, this is a typical analysis where we evaluate two different drugs, but it provides the complete picture. So it's effectiveness and safety. So to help physicians guide guide conversations with patients. Which drug should I use? Sort of the benefit and the risks. And then my last slide is data that supported a new formulation. It supported an EMA approval of a new formulation. So that's in some of the ways how our data has been used. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much for the presentation. I think on to our next presentation from Chaya.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure being here with you all today. I am actually substituting for my colleague who wasn't able to make it today, Dr. Matthew Rowe, who's a familiar face here. And I don't look like him. I don't even have the set of achievements that he does, but I do share a passion for informatics with him, which I'll try to bring through with this presentation today. So today I'm going to try to talk about and see what the translatability of being able to replicate an oncology type real world evidence generation model looks like in other specialty areas. And the specialty areas that Varana has experience with are ophthalmology, neurology, and urology. So that is my frame of reference. Next slide, please. So if we try to compare oncology, real world evidence generation platforms with these other specialty areas and look at continuity of care, what we see in oncology that once the patient gets diagnosed with cancer, their care really lives with the oncologist at this point, and the oncologist is responsible for coordinating that care with the primary care provider as well as other specialists. That is not so much the case with these other specialty areas that we have experience with. The care tends to be very episodic. And then if you look at oncology, the primary outcome measure is overall survival, which is binary, right, and very objective. Whereas when you look at some of these other specialties, there is a lot of variability in outcome measures. For instance, if I was to take an example of visual field evaluation for ophthalmology, the test essentially is used a lot for glaucoma evaluation and trying to see if patient has developed, peripheral vision loss. And so how the test is done actually is you look into this machine and you try to track flashes of light with your gaze. And you can imagine, like, if you lose focus for a couple of seconds, you might miss a couple of flashes. That is not really an indication that you have peripheral vision loss, but that is how the test is eventually going to read. So, there is variability and subjectivity in some of the outcomes that are used, which are more functional as compared to, final outcome in oncology. And then the third point is completeness of health record. By virtue of the care being longitudinal in oncology and the oncologist being the central care coordinator, the care is housed in oncology progress notes a lot, and those notes are complete and comprehensive, but that is not so much the case in other specialty areas that we work with. Next slide, please. So the way Verana is trying to solve for these challenges is by combining deep clinical expertise with a scalable data infrastructure. Next slide, please. So Verana's business really rests upon a solid foundation of our relationships with these specialty societies. The way specialty societies work is that they are member-driven organizations. So providers subscribe to the membership of these specialty societies. And with this kind of a relationship between the societies and providers, a large network can be developed. And what happens is that specialty societies and providers together are kind of moving this field forward in terms of specialty medical care in the United States by being able to influence clinical guidelines nationally, by being able to develop guidelines around quality measures, and by being able to develop guidelines around reimbursement. And so these specialties are powerhouses of thought leadership. And so Verana is also able to rely heavily on these specialties for thought leadership, as well as we have our own clinical expertise as well. Next slide, please. So if we look at Verana's team, we are really skinny on technology. We are slim on commercial organization as well, but we have deep expertise in the clinical space, as well as research, as well as data and product. And that is by design, because we want to make sure that we never lose sight of the clinical context in which our solutions are going to be used, as well as representativeness for research, observational research, that our solutions are going to be used. Next slide, please. So if you look at the registries that are developed by the specialty societies that we engage with, these are really, really large and massive volumes of data. So we look at the number of EHRs involved, it's in the hundreds, number of clinicians is in the thousands, number of patients in the millions, and then visits in hundreds of millions. So this is big data. And in addition to that, it is really, really deep, specialty data. Next slide, please. So in addition to challenges with just the sheer scale of the amount of data that we're trying to process, we also have challenges that have been mentioned previously with, EHRs and the variability in EHR data that is inherent. EHRs is a relatively new source of data collection in the healthcare space, so it is to be expected. Right now, at least the adoption is high, which we're very thankful for. So we're able to even get here, but the data still varies. So if you look at something like how cup to disk ratio is captured, sometimes it is semi-structured, sometimes it is structured, sometimes it is just free text. And also sometimes the way it is captured is it's reflective of the patient's eye versus, like left versus right. Sometimes it is the provider's perspective. It's like how the provider is looking at the patient. And providers left side or right side. So it is very challenging to be able to process and curate this data. And then also being able to integrate with so many practices also puts all the practices on different schedules of how they are able to send data. And then there are challenges with that kind of a data lag. In addition to that, like we've already mentioned, specialty care is siloed still. And so that is also represented in the data. So to take an example around here, you can imagine if you go to the ophthalmologist, most ophthalmologists would not integrate with standard diagnostic labs like Quest or LabCorp or whatnot. So they're not really able to output like hemoglobin A1C and all. But if you want to do any observational research around that kind of data, then having patients' diabetes control, is essential. Next slide, please. So even still, starting with EHRs is a good starting point because you get a broader footprint, you get clinical depth, which you don't really get with other data sources like claims. Next slide, please. So the way Verana kind of addresses the gaps inherent in specialty EHR data is by being able to link to other data sources like claims, labs, images, etc. And our data is tokenized, at the patient level via patient identity resolution algorithm so that, it can be easily linked to all these other data sources and expand our use cases similar to the ones that Leslie talked about in her presentation. Next slide, please. Our data architecture is largely translatable to all the 3 specialty areas that we work with. And there are 3 main reasons for it, 3 best practices that we follow, which has made that possible. Next slide, please. So the first thing is we develop fit for purpose information models. So if you look at our ingestion information model, it is very loose and flexible, and it is based around the interoperability standards that are available now in the industry. Next slide, please. If you look at our observational research information model, though, it models after a lot of the standards that have been talked about during this presentation, like PCORNet, OMOP, I2B2, etc. And this is, again, by design. This model is very structured, and for ease of querying, it has been developed this way. And then also it rests on a solid foundation of semantic harmonization principles. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the second best practice that we use so that our data is translatable to across, the platform is translatable across registries, and that is semantic harmonization. So we normalize all our concepts to standardized vocabularies so that we have consistency in definitions. Next slide, please. Fundamental definitions are then mapped to this kind of an ontology, which is custom developed because SNOMED CT didn't have, had too much granularity for our use cases, and ICD didn't have enough. So we had to kind of develop our custom ontology. But this step is very important because it essentially enables querying in a scalable way, where you can literally write the same query and run it on any of the nodes that you see here, and it will limit the cohort to that particular definition. Next slide, please. So this scaled model is also translatable to data quality. This is our data quality framework, which again allows for standard querying because we're able to score all our data across the 6 attributes that are listed on the left-hand side of the slide. And these 6 attributes are chosen based on best practices that have been published by some of the references that are listed in the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. So once we're able to get to this level of being able to score data for quality, we're able to get scores for the entire data set. It makes the next step really, really easy, where all we have to do is compare these scores against thresholds that are set for specific use cases. And if you look at the bottom, the thresholds get more and more stringent as you go to the bottom of the funnel, and cohort sizes get smaller and smaller, more stringent controls you apply on data quality. Next and last slide, please. So based on that, the key takeaways are that there are meaningful opportunities to expand upon the successes of real-world oncology. Evidence generation, specialty societies are great partners to be able to replicate that model with. Scalable specialty agnostic data platform can be built. Data quality can be measured at scale, but as you apply more stringent protocols for data quality, cohort sizes are smaller. Better data standardization, as Mark mentioned at the outset in EHR data, will definitely make that funnel look more like a tube. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm glad to present today.
Great presentation. Thank you, Chaya. Now I'd like to turn to our panel discussants, starting with Patrick Ryan. Patrick?
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Leslie and Chaya, for your presentations. I'm excited to be able to react to some of the discussions here and provide my own perspectives on quality in general. One of the things I think yesterday and today really highlights is the notion of defining what we mean by quality and what our objective of quality is. And I think these two presentations provided a nice counterbalance between the notion of doing prospective data collection to try to ensure data quality on the input versus, and Leslie showed a nice example of that with the Corona Registry, and then Chaya showed a nice example of thinking about data quality as an output, something that one validates or evaluates once data are collected. And I think that it's actually important for us to think about what our goal of capturing data quality issues are. And it's also important to decide, once you think about the construct of data quality, what is your objective to do with that information? One situation is you identify a data quality issue and you decide to take some sort of remediation action to correct it. In the context of what Leslie presented, she showed how the CRF forms go through site performance reviews, and sites are then told, hey, you've got some out of range check or that goes on. So this notion of correcting data is to try to get it to the point of correct. Another possibility, which I think Chaya was trying to illustrate with her dashboard, is simply to be able to quantify error, to understand the extent to which data are imperfect. And I think it's actually an important thing as we think about using real world evidence for any sort of medical decision, and including regulatory grade decisions, is our aspiration to have perfect data, or is our aspiration for us to have fully understood data? And understood data can actually mean quantifying error and accounting for error as part of that analysis process. Just to leverage that point a little bit more fully, Leslie presented that in the Corona Registry, there are over 54,000 patients with rheumatoid arthritis through this very well designed and well curated registry process, collecting complete and rich and high quality information. In contrast, just as Leslie was presenting, I pulled up off of the FDA Sentinel website one of their recent characterizations across the Sentinel network that shows that there's over 500,000 new users of TNF inhibitors from the years 2011 to 2015. So when we talk about this tension that Chaya talked about scale, you have this tension between doing something that is extremely well defined, but potentially doesn't scale to large samples, versus collecting all data, but potentially having concerns about the adequacy. And I think it's important for us to think about what error actually means in this context. When we conduct analyses, we are always worried about producing accurate and unbiased estimates of effects, whether that be studying the safety or comparative effectiveness of our medical products, developing machine learning algorithms for prediction, or even just characterizing disease natural history. We care about error. And really, there's two errors that are competing with each other. The first error is random error, sampling error, that comes from the fact that ultimately we are using some subset of data to be able to draw our inference from. And so we are worried about whether or not we have an adequate sample to represent the population at large. The second collection of error that we think about is systematic error. Thinking about, we oftentimes talk about the concerns about confounding and selection bias, but here I want to point our attention to selection error being measurement error. For any given disease that we want to study in a database, we could ask ourselves the questions, what would change if we knew about the accuracy of a piece of information? So if we knew that a piece of information had high sensitivity, meaning that most of the people with the disease were actually captured, that information had high specificity, that is, most of the people who don't have the disease are not captured, that we have high positive predictive value, that is, most of the people captured actually in fact have the disease. These are metrics that can be used associated with measurement error. And if we could actually get to the point that we were accurately and correctly estimating the measurement error, then in fact, we could pivot this conversation around data quality away from aspirational goal of making data perfect and into the goal of actually quantifying how much imperfectness exists and accounting for that imperfection in our analyses. And I would actually assert that whether we're talking about, in Chaya's last slide, she showed that you might want to funnel your data down from business applications down to regulatory science. I would actually say that it's not actually about funneling the data. It's about deciding how much you're willing to accept error. And that error that we want to actually accept is about whether or not we actually have sufficient confidence in the answer that we're producing to draw a reliable inference, whether that be a regulatory decision or a business decision. I think actually in this context, one of the things that we've been doing in the Odyssey community is trying to focus on this idea of using a network of databases that each have different types of error, different in terms of completeness, different in terms of correctness, different in terms of general accuracy, and trying to quantify that error and bringing that into our analysis. And so whether we talk about prospective data collection from a registry like Leslie presented, or we talk about scalable infrastructures for EHR ingestion and EHR data linked to claims, as Shaya was saying, I think actually if we can pivot this conversation to think not about how do we get correct and quality data, but instead, how do we account for the data that we've got, that may actually allow us to enable use of data more broadly.
Patrick, thank you very much for covering a lot of grounds in your comments. I really appreciate it. So next is Paul Friedman.
Well, first I wanted to thank the Duke Margolis Center for hosting this. It's such an important topic and such a right time to have it. So Mark, thank you also for moderating this session. You know, as I listened to the really thoughtful presentations from Chaya and Leslie, and kudos for the amount of meaningful information you've gleaned from real world data. It's striking just how messy real world data is. And I think fundamentally there are two approaches we can take to address it. One is to impose structure to the mess of the real world, which involves forms, definitions, mapping, asking for additional tests, quality scoring, but ultimately cost and some measure of resistance to the workflow. Terribly important, a significant addition, but we have to recognize those challenges with it. There's a second strategy, and I think what I'll do is talk about the second strategy, and that is simply to automate and orchestrate the mess, to extract it, but without imposing any change in clinical workflows, any change in how data are acquired, and having clinicians continue their practice. And what I thought I would do is give one example of that, one where it's worked well, one where we still have challenges, and then use that as maybe a launching point for brief discussions on how there are real opportunities from a regulatory standpoint to facilitate and develop and grow these. So one of the first projects that, or the project I'll discuss, relates to identification of a low ejection fraction, a weak heart pump, which can be caused, as everyone here knows, by some of the oncology therapies, by a number of disease states, and which is expensive and difficult to measure. It can be an echocardiogram, MRI scan, CT scan. There's variability in how they're read, variability in how they're reported. Assessing the quality of the image interpretation is hard. We hypothesized that an ECG, a 12-lead electrocardiogram, a 10-second ubiquitous, inexpensive, readily available test could be through neural networks, through artificial intelligence, be used to identify the presence of a low EF. And we're talking about using a standard ECG so that we're not changing how it's acquired, we're not changing how medicine is practiced, and we sought to train it. So what we did was, we have a large database from our own institution, and we took a small sample of the 8 million ECGs that are acquired at 500 hertz for 10 seconds across 12 leads, and we matched them using a neural network to the output of an echocardiogram to determine the ejection fraction. Now, a point here, that's not a simple thing, because any given echo report might say visually estimated ejection fraction 45%, Simpson's rule ejection fraction 48%, 3D ejection fraction. So some logic, some natural language processing is required to extract this value. And then what we did was we trained a network. In other words, we fed in an ECG, only the voltage time waveform, that clinical waveform that was acquired as part of a standard test. And we asked the network, what's the ejection fraction? Now in the training process, as everyone here will recognize, the computer takes a guess. It doesn't know. So it says 45%, and we say, no, it's 35%. You iterate that about 50,000 times, and through a process of a gradient descent, it minimizes an error function and ultimately learns how to read an ECG to give an ejection fraction. So then we tested it to see, well, how good is it? And we put in a series of unknowns. And what we found was it's really good. So as you know, the area under the receiver operator curve of a standard medical test, pap smear 0.7, treadmill test 0.85. This test, the ability of the computer to read an ECG and tell you a low ejection fraction is present, 0.93. Then we said, you know, heart disease depends on your age and your sex. And we haven't even told it that. Maybe it can do even better. So we fed into the computer an ECG and age and sex, and it made no difference. And then we said, maybe from reading the ECG, the computer already knows if you're a man or a woman and how old you are. So we asked it, area under the curve for reading an ECG for a computer is 0.97. In other words, a computer reading an ECG is better at determining your sex than most of us are looking at someone walking down the street. I mean, it's a powerful test. And so with all that, I brought this up because it brings up the opportunity of this powerful screening tool that automatically goes into the workflow. And by the way, if you needed to find a cohort of patients with a low ejection fraction, you could start screening people in clinic, or you could run the AI on the thousands or millions of ECGs already in your system, identify who you saw last week who had a low EF, without having to do any queries, any interacting with people, pulling them away from their clinical work to get this kind of data out. It's a form of deep phenotyping because you can really characterize someone's phenotype in a way that can maybe identify subsets of people who respond to medications or who don't respond to medications. And, you know, in the interest of time, I won't go into that topic further, but if there is discussion time, I'd be happy to give examples of that, particularly with related to stroke and anticoagulation. That's when it works perfectly. I'll give you one brief example of one where there are challenges. We're currently doing a global study to see if we can identify if someone is infected with COVID-19 from an ECG. Now, the reason it's attractive is I mentioned 12-lead ECG, but as everyone here is likely aware, you can get an ECG signal from a smartphone. This is one example of the kinds of electrodes. There are many of them that are commercially available that will record an ECG signal via smartphone, upload it, and then you can extract all of this information. And to do this, we've partnered with colleagues from countries around the world. But what we found is even though the ECG signal is relatively small, much less data intense than say an MRI scan or CT scan or other three-dimensional imaging, there is no standard. And so simply getting it to be stored and transmitted in a unified way takes an incredible amount of work. And that lack of standard makes it hard to then train a network. And you know, I point out that although it takes a lot of computing power to train a network, to teach the computer, once it learns, you can run this on a smartphone and you can screen for all sorts of things. We can screen for hyperkalemia. You can screen for low ejection fraction. We've demonstrated screening for silent atrial fibrillation from an ECG acquired during normal rhythm. The rationale for coronavirus is that the virus binds to the spike protein, which is richly expressed in heart cells, and animal models have demonstrated electrocardiographic changes in animals infected with coronaviruses within days. So it could potentially detect early infection, and clearly outcomes depend on heart involvement. And so there are a whole slew of reasons. So a real need would be to have greater standardization. And so one example could be, if I develop an algorithm and I've demonstrated that works in an ECG, I specify any signal that meets these characteristics, sampling rate, 500 hertz, dynamic range, et cetera, then ideally that algorithm should be plugged into any device that matches it. Apple Watch, Samsung Watch, Alive Core electrodes, wearable garments. I mean, if we really want to massively scale data, and it will be messy, but we can use artificial intelligence to clean it, extract meaningful information, then I think there is a real opportunity, but a regulatory framework that would allow a form of a standard to define what the signal must look like that would let us share them better. The second standard that may be slightly beyond the purview of this conversation, but I'll just mention it, would be, and because I think it would affect all of these, would be a standard acceptable security or encryption that would allow all of us to share data, identifying information encrypted, so that, for example, we wouldn't have to go through, IRBs wouldn't have to worry about HIPAA compliance and other things. They said, if you meet this technical standard, the data are secure and you can share them. And that would greatly enhance what all of us are trying to do in having clean data, widely shareable, essentially to improve the human condition through understanding it better. So I'll stop here and just thank you for the opportunity.
Great, Paul. Thank you very much. And we'll, plenty of issues in these comments to come back to, but right now I'd like to go to Peter DeVault.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Duke Margolis for inviting me to participate in what's been a great event so far. In some ways, my remarks will probably straddle both this session and the following one, in that I would like to address some of the aspects of system design that go into scalability and data use, specifically around EHRs, of course. One way I like to think of the EHR is not only as a data source, but as a data nexus. So data is coming into EHRs from a very wide variety of sources and actors, including clinicians, resulting agencies such as laboratories, devices, and patients themselves. And when we're looking at a particular data element, it's important to know where it came from, or whether it might come from multiple places, and what is the optimal site to sample the data from, what's the optimal place to enrich that data, et cetera. And given that it's difficult to add signal to information or information to the signal once it's left its origin, often those opportunities lie in upstream systems. Now, having said that, because the EHR is a nexus for so many of these streams of data, we need to talk about what it takes for an EHR to scale in support of real-world data use and capture. And there's an intentionality to this. That is, you can't simply build out certain workflows or data elements for a particular purpose, and without the intentionality behind it, expect that to transfer to the next use case. So when building systems that scale, there are a number of dimensions that are important. So the system has to scale within a particular instance, that is within a particular health system, and from our perspective also across the entire customer base. It also has to support across, scale across the number of different use cases without necessarily knowing ahead of time what those use cases might be. And of course, all important to our users as well as everybody on the panel is it needs to be able to scale across an individual actor's workload. So in terms of what scalability actually means, there are a number of things that we could talk about. Some of them are important but less interesting, such as how many concurrent users can your system have, or how many patient records can you churn through in a second when you're performing a query. But I'd like to talk about scalability in terms of data capture use cases and data use cases. So there are both technical and non-technical aspects to scalability. One of them is interoperability. So when we design new features at Epic within the system, whether it's data capture features or anything else, one of the things that we always have front of mind is how is the outputs from this process, whether it's data or other artifacts, how can those be shareable and how can they be comparable from site to site? Another example is that if you're looking at a particular use case, one way of supporting that with interoperability would be to build out a particular FHIR resource that can then be used to extract the data and transport to another locale. But it's not enough in large systems like this to build out a single FHIR resource. You have to build out an entire FHIR infrastructure so that as those resources are modified or new ones come along, you're in a good position to hit the ground running and build out those new capabilities. You also have to have some analytic tools in the system to do things like workflow analysis. So is it possible to tell, looking at your EHR system, what are the different workflows that contribute to the presence of a particular data element? Can you find that out? Can you say, well, over in this department, we can see these workflows are used by these clinicians in a different department, perhaps at a different hospital where there's a different division of labor. These are the workflows that are contributing to that data. It's important to be able to, as Patrick nicely put it, account for the data we've got. In terms of the data elements themselves, the underlying data model needs to be flexible but rational. Flexible in the sense that as a specialty organization or even a clinician decides that there's a new piece of information that's important to capture, you need to be able to add that to the data model without, for example, waiting for your vendor to come up with the next release of the software that includes that. So you need to be able to have some local autonomy in defining the data model itself. On the other hand, it needs to be rational in the sense that it needs some governance over that process. So that, for example, when one of our customers adds onto the data model, they can tell us that they've done so, and we can, either before they've deployed that new data element or afterwards, do our own analysis to determine whether in fact it is or is not already part of the 200,000 data elements that are in the data model, and then augment it only if it's necessary. Another aspect of the data model is that it needs to be designed for multiple uses. So any given data element needs to be able to accommodate multiple, often unforeseen data uses. So while there might be a user interface terminology to which a data element or a control on the screen is bound, it needs to be able to accommodate other reference terminologies, be able to be bound to those other terminologies that might be use case specific. And to Paul's excellent point, we need to be able to orchestrate the mess, in Paul's words, without changing clinical practice in many cases. So the question should always arise, can data that we want be collected as a byproduct of work that's already being done? So when we have a data element that can be bound not only to a user terminology, but to multiple reference terminologies, that allows you, for example, to document your exam of a patient through the normal processes and using the normal forms that you do, but also to be collecting as a byproduct of that data elements against specific ontologies that are useful for other purposes. In terms of scalability that's not necessarily technical, we have to consider the user communities as well. So clinicians participate not only in specialty organizations, but also in things like their vendor-specific users groups. And are often responsible for, in part at least, for the governance of over data models and workflows, answering questions like, do we need these additional data elements, or can we use data that we're already collecting? Should all possible workflows that can generate data, should they all be allowed? Or should we constrain ourselves to particular workflows that we can then manage? Now, back to the idea of the EHR as a data nexus, one of the things that we're really keen to stress is that the EHR should not just be a place to extract data from, but that data should be sent back to the EHR, whether that's in terms of numerical scores that might be calculated or risk factors that are calculated outside of the confines of the EHR, but also in the form of research-derived artifacts. So are there better practices that we now know about based on the data that's been derived from practice that we can feed back into that learning healthcare system? And the final thing that I'll end my remarks on is to note that use cases don't exist in isolation, and there are surprising synergies between very disparate types of use cases. One example that I still think of as somewhat magical, even though I was deeply involved in developing it here at Epic, is the intersection between our development of a repository of EHR-derived data coming from multiple sources within our user community and interoperability built for clinical practice, so point of care interoperability. So when we are exchanging documents between different healthcare systems because a patient is receiving care at those different systems, we send highly identified data back and forth. It needs to be highly identified so that you can be certain on both sides of that transaction that you're dealing with the same patient. Now, knowing that data sets correspond to a single patient and not two different patients is very difficult in many research settings because you've stripped out everything you need in order to identify a patient in many cases. What we've done here is make use of the patient matching activity that's happening 5 or 6 million times a day with our Care Everywhere interoperability platform, making use of that activity to match de-identified data sets for our data aggregation platform. I'll leave it as an exercise for the listener to figure out how to apply that to other examples. But my point is just that let's not think about, even if they seem like very different things, research and clinical practice often do, think about ways in which efforts in one area can apply to others. Thanks, Mark.
Hey, thanks very much for those comments, Peter. And I'd like to pick up on your last point. We've got a bit of time for discussion since you all stayed on time, and I appreciate the questions that have come in from participants and those of you who are viewing this event. And let me start out with a general topic, more about where we're going. So thinking about not just designing our interventions to get to better real world evidence, better real world data systems for today, but how can we leverage trends that are taking place already? And I'd like to pick up on Peter's last comments about getting to more interoperability and better systems, and maybe breaking down the distinction between research and clinical practice, which also I think fits with something that Paul mentioned about the directions to go for better data are trying to impose some more structure, make the data itself better in the clinical setting, or trying to take some steps to automate and use tools and add-ons, as many of you all talked about, to take that data, augment it, clean it up, and make it more suitable for use. I mean, it does seem like we're on a long-term trajectory, and maybe there's some things to do to accelerate to bring those two together. For just listening to some of these talks, Chaya, the kinds of measures that you all are calculating for the research uses in rheumatoid arthritis, say, seem like things that clinicians would really like to know, not just roughly are patients getting worse or better, but what is their functional status? I mean, that's one of the main things that the patients with rheumatoid arthritis really care about in the end. And Paul and some of the cardiovascular applications, having access to interpretable, understandable data for clinical purposes that people are collecting on their own, EKGs or other sources of remote monitoring, seems really helpful as well, all going to the point that Peter made about the EHR becoming a better nexus for data that is actually usable for clinical care as well as for research. I mean, the more longitudinal, all of those things seem like things that we'd want. So maybe turn to each of you for just a brief comment on what should we be aiming for here? How can we encourage, if that is the right direction, more movement, the data getting better and the analytic tools getting better, not only for research, but for purposes of improving clinical care? Maybe you could start with Leslie and Chaya, and I guess a couple of other things to think about as we consider this topic. Research is governed under very different rules than clinical care is, with HIPAA protections and privacy on the one hand, and research consent and the like on the other. Does that create problems? And are there really generalizable solutions? Back to this session being about what can we learn beyond oncology that's applicable across all areas, or the FHIR standards or other applications of MCODE standards or the like? Are we going to get to more unified steps that can really bring this all together? So I know it's a big set of topics, but I really would like you all to comment on where we're headed and the implications for the work at FDA. Maybe Leslie, starting with you.
Sure. So I'm going to wear my clinician hat for this answer. I think we need to make it easier for physicians to do the right thing. It's very hard to see patients in this day and age. And I think, coming up with tools to make it easy for them to gather the patient information, to document their exams so that they can be monitoring as time goes on in a longitudinal fashion, and to see how their patients are tracking in terms of their disease activity. I think those sorts of tools are going to be very helpful to guide physicians. Right now, they're just too busy. It's like death by a million clicks. That would be my thought.
Thank you. And Chaya?
Yeah, so I feel like the technological problem is an easier problem to solve, especially with the progress that has been made already with Smart on Fire and other fire type standards, where companies can keep their data models proprietary, but at the same time can share, and build these types of feedback loops. But I think the main concern is alignments of incentives and just the regular routine. So for instance, we look at a clinician, they have to take time out of their busy schedule and try to improve documentation on their end so that then the data can be, say, secondarily used for research. And that is not fair to a clinician whose primary job and responsibility is to take care of the patients, and adds a lot of, like Leslie said, clicks and takes a lot of their day to be able to do that. So we can come up with models that are a little bit more flexible. We can learn a little bit from the financial industry as well. Like, people were scared and worried about sharing their information. There are breaches that have happened with Equifax and those kinds of organizations at that level, which kind of are scary. But also, if we let all those types of things hold us back, then they will. Right. So it is possible. If you look at some companies like, say, Datament, for instance, who are one of the presenters today, very simple idea, but the way they're able to tokenize the data and all the different ecosystems where they link data with, kind of removes the possibility of PHI ever exchanging hands. And you can still link and create these data sets, which can be leveraged for a lot of the real world use cases. So that is my kind of 2 cents. Is like, technologically, it's easier to solve. It's more about incentive alignment.
Thank you. And Patrick?
So as you were asking your question, Mark, I couldn't help to think about both the similarities of reuse of data at the point of clinical care, but also the differences between what it means to do reuse at the point of population health analytics. And I think as it relates to this question of data quality, it in part comes down to the consequences of data quality. So when we're talking about point of care applications, the completeness and correctness of an individual person's collection of time-stamped observations potentially matters. You provided the example of functional status. Well, it matters a lot to that patient who's having the interaction with the provider, that if the patient is provided in a piece of information, that they're seeing that same exact piece of information back. At a population health level, if I'm at Mayo Clinic, maybe I just need to understand the trends of my population. And if an individual data element for an individual patient is wrong, but we can understand and quantify the error to which that is either incomplete or incorrect, then we can still draw inferences about the management of our practice. And if I'm at the FDA level, I'm thinking about a network of databases for which potentially every single data point could be a little bit incomplete or incorrect, but the population level questions that we're asking about disease natural history and the effects of medical products, as long as we can understand the error that exists, we can still draw valid inferences about the safety and effectiveness of medical products. And so I think I agree that these data, a lot of them have in common that we should be able to reuse them at multiple layers of decision making. But I think that this question of data quality might actually vary, and our level of acceptance and our level of concern about error might actually differ depending on the decision context.
Great, thank you. And next, Paul. You may be on mute.
Sorry about that. 2 thoughts. The first is kind of building on the previous comments. I like the idea of the EHR being a nexus, but not necessarily in my mind for data storage. That is, there's a ton of data in a CT scan and an MRI scan and in 30 days of ECG monitoring. And I'm not sure that there's so much subspecialty technical expertise, but I would love to see it be the hub and the nexus for a clinical encounter. And building on the points that actually Leslie, Anchai, and Patrick all made in terms of quality, I'll just give a few examples. I'm an electrophysiologist. I see patients with atrial fibrillation all the time. I walk up to the EMR and I either have to ask the patient or start digging to see what their CHADS VASC score is, a scoring system of congestive heart failure, hypertension, age, diabetes, previous stroke, vascular disease, to see what their stroke risk is. And my first thought is, why doesn't the EMR tell me? it has the information. It knows I'm an electrophysiologist. It knows the patient's coming to me. It should immediately say, you're about to see Mr. Jones, who's 67, has a CHA2DS2-VASc score of 3. Why do I have to dig through a long list of ECGs? And in our system, I'm waiting for a PDF presenter at 2 seconds a click, getting back to, it's a very real barrier to care, when it should just say, here are the 3 that show atrial fibrillation that you might want to see. And then here's all of them if you want to see them. And if there are data standards and definitions, why doesn't it use those and ask the patient on the portal, you're about to see Dr. Friedman, how far can, how many flights of stairs can you go? Just ask the questions using standard definitions so that it would tell me the patient has answered these questions consistent with the New York Heart Association Class 2. So I think there is a real opportunity for the EMR to up its game in terms of being it's made huge strides. I'm not trying to sound critical of it. I'm looking more ahead of what is the next step. And the last one that really gets to me are the billing codes, because they're obscure and complicated. And that knows what I've done. I've just holded everything I dictate live. And so I'd love the EMR to say, the suggested visit is follow-up visit 30 minutes, and it knows how long I was with the patient because I was in the computer. And so why is it asking me? And then of course, you want human oversight, but just think about the opportunity that could open for the work that Leslie is doing and Chaya is doing, what Patrick is interested in, all of us. The EMR could be the nexus for prompting and giving us a multiple choice, and that immediately becomes such a pleasure. It's the difference between opening up your smartphone, where it's so intuitive. You push a button and I see a picture of my daughter and I'm talking to her, right? Versus a computer where I'm saying, what do I click on and why is this billing code not here? And I have to wrench it in. And I mean, and they're all reflective of the complexity. So again, I want to emphasize that the capabilities that the EHRs have given us are huge. And of course, I'm greedy and say, this is great. I have a taste of the candy. I want more of it. And so I do think there are real opportunities to embed a lot of these things in the EHR. The second comment will be technical standards that I would love to see regulatory bodies approach. And that would be FHIR for cardiology. It could be ECG like for DICOM, where we simply say, look, if you're going to record an ECG on someone, no matter what manufacturer you are, here's the expected dynamic range of the voltage, here's the sampling rate. And then if any company in California or Boston or New York or Minnesota or wherever comes up with an algorithm, it knows that if it gets these inputs, it'll have a reliable outcome. And then it'll make the job for the regulators that much easier. Because you have an expected input within a certain range, you just test that, and then you don't have to do another clinical study because you go, all right, I get it. When I have these signals, when I run it through this algorithm, I get this output, and it's trustworthy. So anyway, those are the 2 areas that I would love to see more discussion and development.
Thank you. And Peter?
Yeah, a couple of comments. Other than, Paul, you should talk to your EHR vendor.
I do. All the time.
A couple of things. One of them, building off of something you said, Paul, which is that often the person we should be looking to capture the data from is the patient themselves. So what a clinician might see as a chore, I've got to enter this data into the system to complete my encounter, the patient can see in many cases as welcome participation and engagement. And often, of course, the data is of better quality if it's coming from closer to the source. Another comment I wanted to make about data either staying in the EHR or coming back to the EHR is an observation of how things have started to change, and it's a welcome change. In earlier days, when we would work with a group doing a lot of research, we would often get requests to build case report forms where data could be collected and then sent off to the research system in such a way that it's not still in the EHR. That was a desideratum, right? We don't want that to live in the EHR because it's research data. I'd like to live in a world where that's less and less acceptable, and I think we're getting there. But data that we are collecting for research should be, if it's important, it should be important for multiple purposes, including feeding back into current care, both for the clinician working with the patient, but also for the patient themselves.
So an EHR that's actually useful for clinical care, and it seems aligned with the research purposes too. Well, so you all did a great job of both teeing up some of the challenges around data at entry, around some of the opportunities and challenges to improve that data and hopefully put it back together as more of a effective nexus for both clinical care and research. So they're not the same things as Patrick described. We're also not going to see perfection on either side, but understanding the errors that can cause both noise and bias seems like a good path forward in combination with all of the steps that you all have described for making progress in these areas outside of oncology. So thank you very much for a great panel discussion. We are now going to take a short online break until 2:20 Eastern time. So we'll all rejoin you then. In the meantime, you can't do applause as well in this context, but I'd like to thank all of our panels for a great discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'd like to welcome you all back to the continuation of our web event today with now starting session 4 on emerging tools and technologies to support high quality data capture. So this is a nice extension of some of the topics that came up in the last session. Just as a reminder, we did get some good input for our questions and topics and discussion in the last section. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to see us address in our time available in this session, please email us at margolisevents@duke.edu. That's margolisevents@duke.edu. And you can also tweet about the event this afternoon at #RWD-ecosystem. So #RWD-ecosystem. So let's get started on this discussion of emerging tools and technologies to support high quality data capture. We're going to focus on the technical advances and emerging trends involving data standards, information collection tools, and new workflows, topics that came up with the last session. As well. These trends include machine learning and natural language processing tools, data visualization techniques, and data standards and architectures that utilize application programming interfaces. All of these potential solutions are fundamentally aimed at reducing the burden of data capture and scaling up workflows and activities. So to have this discussion, I'm very pleased to welcome Sam Roos, who's co-founder at Datavant, Ryan Moog, Director and Solution Executive of Research at Cerner Corporation, Ian Shackle, who's founding chairman of Augmetics, Stephanie Reisinger, who's Vice President and General Manager of Veradigm Life Sciences, which is a business unit of Allscripts Healthcare, and Brian Anderson, the Chief Digital Health Physician at the MITRE Corporation. For those of you who are joining us, again, please send those questions via email to margolisevents@duke.edu or the hashtag on Twitter, RWE ecosystem. So #RWD ecosystem. So Sam, welcome. I'd like to start with you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for a fantastic job of teeing up and moderating this discussion. To Duke Margolis for inviting me to participate and for convening this awesome workshop. And to all of the other presenters and panelists for what has turned out to be a really illuminating dialogue today. So just by way of quick introduction, my name is Sam Rose. So I come from the industry side of healthcare technology. Several years back founded Datavant, which is a company providing de-identification and linking solutions for those working with real world data to be able to pull together different data sets in a privacy protecting fashion. So I've since recently transitioned out of Datavant for new adventures, but as I share a little bit more about patient matching today, if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to put you in touch with the appropriate counterparts at Datavant. So I have a couple topics that I'm going to cover in remarks today. So the first is how we can use data linking and particularly pulling in external data to help assess data quality of what we capture. And the second is opportunities to improve the quality of matches that we can achieve through both data standardization as well as improving our compliance with filling in certain data points. So I'll start with really one of my kind of favorite mantras, which is it is tremendously hard to improve what you can't effectively measure. And so as we think today about the various methods that we can use to improve the quality of data capture, we also have to think in the same breath about what is the way that we're going to measure quality, and how do we know that the changes that we've implemented are actually having the desired effect. This is tremendously important because, as we all know, there can be tremendous heterogeneity in the way that patients are managed and care is delivered. And so as we seek to separate the wheat from the chaff and identify normal care and normal differences in care from errors in data entry, we need to put in place the methods to characterize what does good look like and what is fit for purpose. So one approach, which I won't go into at length as it's been covered by both other presenters today and previous Margolis sections, is looking at the intrinsic qualities of the data, the completeness, consistency with known biology, looking at the free text compared to the standard data within EHR, and using that as a means of assessing the quality of a data set. A second approach is assessing the quality through concordance. And so as we think about the journey of a given patient, their story is not just told in a single data set, but is fragmented and often retold in many different data sets held by many different players within the healthcare system. So for instance, if you think about an A1C value captured in an EHR, that very same value may be captured within the data set of a reference lab. And additional context on that value can be understood through pulling in additional longitudinal history about the patient and looking at past values and how it jives with what is reflected within a given data set. And so as we start to pull together different elements of that patient's story, we can start to paint a picture of what their care journey looks like in total, and start to get a greater understanding of which data points might be an outlier in care, but reflect a true value versus those that might be a data entry error. And so as we look at using this method to both improve our perspective of a patient and refine our understanding of the accuracy of the data, it's also important to recognize that matching itself has the potential to introduce error into an analysis. And as Patrick Ryan had shared in an earlier session, as we think about our attitude towards error, it's application dependent. And that is just as true as we think about patient matching and linking, that we need to take the appropriate method for the question at hand, and what's right for commercial applications and health economics and outcomes research might not be right for patient care and for clinical research and vice versa. So we look at the methods that are used to match disparate data sets. One of the things that first struck me getting into this space is how relatively little data you actually need to be able to confidently match the majority of patients. So you can get upwards of 80% of a given population reliably matched with relatively few values, first name, last name, date of birth, sex, and as you start to do a little bit of pre-processing, you can even drive that number up. But there is considerable potential for error even as you have more personally identifiable information about a patient. You can have collisions in populations that have the same first and last name. This is particularly true wherever the frequency of those names cluster together in a particular geography. A Bob in one data set may be a Robert in another. Some data may have a junior or senior appended to it. Others might have it in a separate field. And so as we look at different methods to pull together different data sets, there are meaningful opportunities for standardization to improve the quality of matches that we can achieve and to expand the area under the curve, so to speak, of what we can do with linking. And so good news is that there are very sharp people already working on this. So ONC has operated and maintained a set of standards in the US core data for interoperability, recently revised to include some values like email and phone number in addition to the common data sets that are captured for personally identifiable information. And while this has been fantastic work and meets some meaningful needs to expand that area under the curve, there's still work to do. And so I don't have time to go into all of the different facets within this context if you're interested in learning more, I would encourage you very much to go to Sean Granis at the Regenstrief Institute of Indiana University. Pew Research has also done some great work here. But one that I will dive a little bit deeper into is a particularly advantageous change that we can make to improve matching, and that's transitioning the formatting of addresses to the U.S. Postal Service standard. Again, this is something that has come up both in research and has been proposed to ONC. One of the areas why this has not yet occurred is that while the U.S. Postal Service maintains a free service for retailers to standardize their address, their terms of service don't yet support the use by healthcare entities. And so this highlights a meaningful opportunity to build bridges with other industries, with other users of data, and to pull in methods that are used to match identity in other locations to help support what we can achieve in healthcare. And so I'll just close with one more remark, and that's just reiterating what has been said countless times by various presenters and panelists today. And that's what is good for research is often also good for clinical care. As we think about these two fields, they're not really separate disciplines so much as they are convergent. And as we look to incorporate tools that improve patient matching for research, those very same tools are going to be those that ensure consistency of the data for a patient within the EMR as we build that EHR nexus, and ensure that the information available to the clinician is both accurate and comprehensive for the patient that's in front of them. So thank you, and looking forward to a good conversation to come.
Great. Thanks very much, Sam. And next, I'd like to turn to Ryan Moog.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And thanks to everyone for joining this session. It's been such an educational component for us. As I was listening to Sam talk, one of the things that was clear to me was so many of us have come to the same sort of realizations over the course of time. And so this is an opportunity for us to share and not only put a collared shirt on for the first time in weeks, but share a little bit about how we're approaching some of the same problems. This is a really critical topic for us at Cerner. We have an onus as a large EHR provider to help sort some of this out and help solve it on behalf of our clients. So also I asked, as I make a couple of comments here, that consider that I'm joining as Cerner as a data platform, or an EHR nexus, if you will, to use some other comments we heard in the last session, not just as an EHR as a clinical documentation platform. So much of where we're headed is based on what we've learned. So over the last 20 years or so, Cerner had already built a national RWD platform of sorts in concert with a subset of our clients who had agreed to contribute data and then let it be used for research and use it for some of their own research. What we learned along with that, where we were connecting Cerner Millennium EHR clients to other Cerner Millennium EHR clients to a Cerner real-world data set called Health Facts, was that is exceptionally powerful for some use cases and not fit for purpose for others. So it was a EHR exhaust platform where we really got a strong idea of what was discretely being captured in the EHR, what the EHR might have visibility to from other systems, and ultimately a really powerful use case where a source of data where we had strong coverage of the EHR and where there was a lot of documentation, but not necessarily strong coverage in all conceivable places. So not strong coverage in the outpatient, not strong coverage where there might have been more unstructured documentation versus structured. So that's where we've come from, and that's what we've learned from, and that's what we've started building out capabilities for in concert with our clients. So I'll share a couple of lessons learned and then one example, a real world example of how this has come to fruition. One of those lessons learned is very technical and one's very procedural, but I think they both fit under this banner of modern solutions to this problem. From a technical perspective, the one thing we learned is virtually no health system only has documentation happening in one EHR platform. That's very, very common out in the real world for health systems, especially as they go on their own M&A journeys, as they affiliate with other regional health authorities. The picture of a patient as they move across, even within an individual IDN, not to mention across the country throughout that patient's life, it tends to be looking at one EHR system tends to be very non-longitudinal. Fortuitously, over the last 10 years, in order to solve this problem, not from a real world data perspective, but from an individual health management perspective for those individual providers, Cerner had built out a cloud platform that created a longitudinal record that was source agnostic. That's why I say I joined a Cerner the data platform, not just a Cerner the EHR. So for hundreds of health systems across the US now, we've worked with them to construct a longitudinal picture of their patients for their own local management. And so independent of which EHR source, which claim source, which lab source, which revenue cycle source that those data might have come from, we really had to stitch that together, and that became, in the branding sense, Cerner's Healthy Intent platform. But it presented an opportunity for us because data are already being constructed longitudinally at a local level for their own local clinical, operational, financial use cases to then, and this is point 2 here, the non-technical, the maybe less technically interesting, but in my personal opinion, even more important is the procedural element here, in that we had to go out and build bidirectional, strong strategic relationships with our health systems across the US to help work together, work in concert to go grow a real world data set that works for all of us. So one of the critical pieces that my team's been working on over the last 2 years is building out what we call our Learning Health Network, where it's a network of client organizations of health systems of all different shapes and sizes, academic, pediatric, large IDNs, community hospitals, who are on some component of the Cerner platform to work with them to say, number one, we want to include you in how these data are governed. Everything we do here is good science and follows standard principles for what data can and should be used for, since ultimately the health systems are the custodians of those data. Number two, that we're actually involving them in the use of those. And number three, we're actually working in concert with them to curate and refine the data. So here's an example of what I mean. First of all, when we onboard a health system into that, it's a very low IT lift for them. So they join the network, and it doesn't become a thing that becomes a multi-day, multi-week, multi-month effort for them to join. And that's how we're helping grow the diversity of the data set. But then ultimately, we're also then working together with them where they're part of our funded projects or part of their own projects, where they're helping out with things like data augmentation, chart review, and helping supplement those data with additional curatable elements so that ultimately we have a really, not just a longitudinal structure that the technology gives us, but also a really complete structure. And we're working with the clinicians, the research staff, and the teams locally at those health systems, because this tool then becomes not just an observational research tool, but a clinical trial tool. So I'd say independent, and to kind of bring it back out of the Cerner world into a broader industry perspective, independent of the technical platforms, we found that it's really critical to use that clinical platform that's already being curated, but then to have the relationships in place where we can work together in concert with those health systems to curate the data. I'll close on one quick example of where we've seen this be really beneficial. Over the last few months, we've worked together with our academic organizations to generate a COVID-19 data cohort. We've been able to do that really rapidly and push data out with them very quickly because we're using a platform that's already in place. We didn't have to go recreate the world and push down forms to go collect them. And because we have direct line of sight into those health systems and have direct contacts and can work with them to go curate the data, we don't have to go reinvent the wheel as new ICD-10 codes come out. It becomes part and parcel of that relationship we have with them, that the platform we've built out, and then the relationship we have with them to unlock data for the purposes of research.
Thanks very much, Ryan, for those comments. And next I'm going to go to Ian Shaquille.
Hey everyone, Ian here, founder, chairman of Augmetics. Here today to really provide the Silicon Valley technology point of view of all of these topics of the day. I'm looking forward to it. So for starters, probably helps to understand what Augmetics does and why we exist. Well, as all of you know, over the last decade or more, we've been urging doctors to adopt the electronic health record and then add more and more fields and structure and processes. And nobody on the left and no one on the right would argue that this is a really needed and overdue thing. But along the way, we've really been experiencing outrageous productivity dips, doctor burnout, doctors leaving the practice, and horrible degradation of the patient experience along the way. Everybody knows this problem, and it's my belief that there's no amount of legislation or workflow modification that can really solve this problem. And the only way to really make this fit, in other words, have doctors have more structured notes and adopt the EHR, but also survive past burnout, is through technology innovation. And that's what Augmetics does. That's why we founded this company. So I'll tell you a little bit about how it works. Doctors that use our service at the point of care, when they're speaking with patients, would not have their backs turned to their patient typing away on the computer on the EHR, but rather they would be wearing Google Glass, or they would be wearing a phone on a necklace or on a stand. And then they would be having natural conversations with their patients, like they always wish they could have done. And in the background, we live stream audio and video from the point of care to our platform. And then we take that conversation and we create beautifully structured notes in the pending status, in Cerner, in Epic, and whatever EMR that the doctor uses. And we do it better and faster than what the doctor would do on their own. And this has the net effect of saving a doctor a shocking two or three or more hours a day, allowing the doctor to focus on the patient right in front of them, and allowing for a much better patient experience. I think a key thing about our approach is that it's ambient. A lot of solutions that jump in and try to alleviate this problem require doctor manipulation, verbatim transcription or dictation, or you name it. And doctors are already overloaded past the point of no return. So if you're going to innovate in this space, you have to really come up with something ambient, and that's what we've done. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about how it works behind the scenes. What's really happening is we are live streaming the audio and video from Glass or phone or even telemedicine calls like Zoom calls to a tech-enabled remote scribe. So this human scribe can see and hear what the doctor sees and hears, is the guardian angel from far away, and is summarizing and structuring the conversation in real time as it progresses. They are armed in their scribe cockpit with an array of artificial intelligence tools, natural language processing expanders, ASR speech rec modules, and you name it, to deburden the scribe workflows. But nonetheless, a human in the loop solution is certainly needed if we're going to be ambient. And that's another kind of learning that I would kind of bring to you from Silicon Valley. There's a lot of hype these days about pure AI solutions being able to do everything from A to Z, all software, no humans. And I think I'm here to say that's not the case. If you really want to be ambient, in some way, shape, or form, you're going to have to involve a human in the loop, and our workflow is predicated on that. And over time, we can improve our scribe-to-doctor ratios and deburden scribing in various ways, but that human in the loop is going to stay for years and years to come. So with our solution, we're now very much in scale mode. We're out there selling to large health systems, the likes of Dignity and Sutter and CHI. We have more than a dozen such customers, and we serve oncology, rheumatology, primary care, orthopedics, over 20 different specialties. We're growing very, very quickly. So everything that I've said thus far is really what I like to think of as sort of the chapter 1 of Augmetics: saving time, improving productivity, combating doctor burnout. That in and of itself is a massive opportunity, something that can keep us all busy for years to come. But along the way, Augmetics has sort of earned a privileged position to do so much more. And I think that's where we're beginning to intersect with the topics we've been discussing today. One thing that we're seeing and starting to do is sort of steer our scribes and our platform to not just document as the doctors wish, but to actually dramatically improve the documentation beyond their preferred baseline pre-augmetics. So we're able to shake them out of their own individual personal Shakespeare and bring about levels of standardization that the health systems and folks performing research very much care about in a way that simultaneously deburdens the doctor, which is sort of the holy grail. You know, in the old days, if somebody wanted to add a field, you know, no doctor would tolerate this, but when you can kind of let augmetics perform the documentation or something like us, add more fields, add more structure, and we're here to help the medicine go down, so to speak. So we have the position, sort of the carrot and stick to really make that possible. Participation in research and registries and other things that are critically important to many of the attendees today. And going beyond that, I think another thing we bring is the marriage of the conversational graph with EHR data. Yes, there's a lot of valuable information in the EHR, but it's my opinion that so much of real healthcare takes place in conversation between doctor and patients. And so solutions like ours are able to marry and timestamp those two very valuable data set for a lot of good purposes that I'm sure many of you are thinking about. And another cool thing that we kind of package into our sort of chapter 2 vision here is the ability to not just better document, but change doctor behavior and healthcare workflows. So when you use something like augmetics at the point of care, we can also, you know, nudge doctors to do things they would otherwise not do for clinical trial participation, tee up those next steps, split stream in an expert. All of these made possible by having this privileged position and having a scribe and technology in the loop to perform this. So hopefully that's helpful to understand one example of ways we can tackle burnout and improve our data quality and structure for all of you today to take use of in the future. So I look forward to further participation today on this panel. Thank you.
Brian, if you don't mind us going to you next. Next turn to Brian Anderson, who's the Chief Digital Health Physician at MITRE.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the chance to speak here with you and my fellow panelists. So when I think about the various technologies and tools that are available to advance real-world data collection, one of the first things that I wanted to speak about was this concept of building coalitions around specific use cases and identify the critical, I'll call it, minimal set of data elements around which technical standards can be brought to bear to structure those elements, to better inform how they can be structured and collected in as low a burden way as possible. Mark, on the last panel, you had mentioned this idea of every clinician, particularly cardiologists, would like to know things like the functional status of their patients. And wouldn't it be a great idea if we could come together around a specific way to capture something like that in an EHR? And I want to make sure that I'm not trying to set up a juxtaposition of whether it's technologies that would enable the better capture of RWD by leveraging machine learning or NLP. I think it's both that and identifying what are the minimal sets of data elements that we really need crucially to set up all the various applications and capabilities that can come downstream that you can bring to bear on an EHR. And so one of the efforts that the MITRE Corporation, in partnership with a large group of stakeholders, from the EHR vendors that have been on the phone to application developers and other stakeholders, is around M-code and minimal common oncology data elements. I know that Dr. Monica Bertinelli spoke about it earlier in day one. But the concept is fairly simple and straightforward, but I think it bears just spending a few minutes on. Identifying the specific things that matter most to patients, to caregivers, be them just providers at the point of care or researchers. Identifying what are those critical primary and secondary endpoints that we need to come to an agreement on to structure what is the value set that we need to structure around, and then taking technical standards like FHIR or HL7V2, and then partnering with the modelers to build the common data model that is needed for EHR vendors to adopt, for application vendors and other vendors to adopt on the technical back end that would then make all the tools that we want to see brought to bear and impactful possible. And so in MCode, what we've done is we've formed a FIRE accelerator group. It's called Codex, that does just that. It brings together the guiding coalition of stakeholders from the end users, be them patient advocacy groups, to EHR vendors, to health systems, to other IT and application builders, into a common community to identify the specific use cases that matter most in oncology, to identify the elements that need to be structured, and then actually build the applications and build the tools that are needed. They encompass things like registry reporting, clinical pathways for oncology, other minimal sets of data elements that are needed for some of the most important things that caregivers need and patients need to live better and healthier lives in oncology. And it's something that we're looking to do, and I believe that we as a community in the real world data space can do in specialties beyond just oncology and in cardiology. And even in this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm struck by Amy Abernathy's presentation yesterday on the evidence accelerator and some of the work that we are doing, that MITRE is doing in a very, very similar vein with the coalition that we've built up. Some of the principles that Amy mentioned, I think bear mentioning again, and they include the ability to conduct your work in as transparent a way as possible, to have it be traceable, to have there be provenance behind it, and sharing. And so why am I mentioning traceability, provenance, sharing, and transparency? Well, I think because they all tie to this concept of if we can agree, if we can hold hands and agree as a coalition on what the common data elements are that we need in a very minimal set to agree on. This is how we're going to capture these data. These are how we're going to do it that is not going to slow providers down, that we need to, whether it be for oncology or cardiology or the COVID-19 pandemic, have an understanding of what those elements are. It will accelerate the kinds of analytical insight that are needed, be it through an NLP technique or an ML technique or some other algorithm. The work that we're doing in the pandemic response has been incredibly challenging because we haven't had that agreement yet. And so it is a lot of coalition building and a lot of time spent in meetings where we are hammering out in a very messy way. Amy also said, we're doing science together and it's messy and there's lots of challenges to it. But part of what we're trying to do is come to agreed upon queries, agreed upon case definitions, agreed upon data elements. And so I would urge us as a community to consider one of the lessons learned from this pandemic, something that we've been trying to apply with MCode and in cardiology as well, is coming to a sense of what are those common data elements that we need to have a agreed upon definition, and then instantiating that into, whether or not you're an EHR vendor or an application builder, instantiating that into the back end to make the kind of analytical approaches that we all need urgently in something like the COVID-19 pandemic more readily available so that we can move faster with eyes wide open and bring together as many people to help answer some of the most urgent questions that we have today. Those are my comments, Mark. I look forward to the conversation afterwards.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate the comments, and I'm going to try with Stephanie if you're on with us. Please go ahead.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
There always has to be one of us, right?
That's fine.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm Steph Riesinger, and I head up the life sciences business at Veradigm, which is a subsidiary of Allscripts. And Sam said something when we started that really resonated with me, and that is what's good for research is good for clinical care. And my role at as head of life sciences research at an EHR company puts me kind of right in the center of that issue, and I'm really excited about it. So we've spent a lot of time today, and probably in the last, in my last 9 years, we talk a lot about data and how to integrate real world data back into our current research process. But for the next 10 minutes, I want to talk about something a little bit different. So next slide. So in the broader macro level healthcare space, there are two significant trends that are really disrupting how healthcare is delivered today. And what I want to propose is they have the potential to disrupt how we do research. And the first trend, and we've talked a lot about this, but it's digital healthcare delivery, and it started about 10 years ago with the Affordable Care Act and the adoption of EHR, which is great, and EHR is mostly adopted. But really, if you think about it today, EHR is just a little piece of what's going on. Pretty much every aspect of healthcare is automated, miniaturized, roboticized, and this is creating for us an information explosion. But the second trend is equally as important, and that's the consumerization of healthcare. So we all have devices. I have one on my arm, but and personal apps they're really empowering us to see and share our health data. So information is not only being generated, but it's being disseminated simultaneously, almost in real time. And this is really driving informed consumers to demand a greater say over their health journey. And it's really making vendors like Allscripts think very, very carefully about what the future looks like in the EHR space. And we in the life sciences space need to pay attention to that. So with this digitization and consumerization, really our human bodies are becoming big data platforms. So how do we take advantage of this? So go to the next slide. So I want to start this slide. While digital healthcare delivery is a huge opportunity, I want to, I would say as an industry, we're struggling to take advantage of it. And really to understand why I say that, I'm gonna share some numbers with you. So I'm gonna start with 2% and go ahead and animate the 2%. So this is the number of people in the US who actually participate in clinical research. And this is very low, and it's low because for a lot of reasons, but protocols are very specialized. There's very narrow patient selection criteria, and the infrastructure to support these studies are expensive and really limits physician and facility participation. Research today is focused on safety and efficacy. It does a great job at that, but I would say it doesn't do a very good job at generalizing those results across populations. So research today really focuses on the ideal world. So the next number I want to talk about is 95%. And go ahead and animate that one. Yeah. So this is the number of, or the percent of people in the US approximately who receive digital healthcare services today. And it represents a huge, broad, heterogeneous population, diverse treatment protocols, and this is a much better environment to understand treatment generalizability in the real world. And so the last number I'll talk about, and this is where it kind of ties together, which is 90%. And this, according to a survey, 90% of people would be willing to participate in research around, a particular disease area that they might have. So I would say that this represents a significantly huge opportunity for our industry. So next slide. But we're really currently struggling to fully take advantage of this digital healthcare delivery and consumerism. And I would say in today's operating model, and I'm going to call it the research operating model, research is almost completely disconnected from digital healthcare delivery. There's a lot of reasons for this. It's based on a legacy model. That model was put together before there was digital healthcare. There were no EMRs. I don't know if you guys remember, we went to the doctors and there were these huge paper filing systems. And so really our model that we use today focuses on collecting data de novo for each study on forms. While technology has made this process much more efficient, we're still automating essentially a form-based workflow. This whole model has evolved and is evolving independently, mainly from digital healthcare delivery, and probably most importantly, the model wasn't developed to really leverage digital healthcare data because it wasn't available. So as a result, we struggle to take advantage of, that's why I say we struggle to take advantage of the explosion of real world data, because we spend a lot of time figuring out how to plug this real world data into our current model, which wasn't really designed to do that. And no doubt, and I'm part of it. I've been doing this for the last 10 years, so that I'm not criticizing, but the current activities have provided significant benefits for our industry. But I respectfully suggest that this approach really doesn't allow us to take full advantage of the opportunities that digital and consumer-driven healthcare delivery could provide for our industry. So go to the next slide. So really for us to and fully take advantage of digital healthcare, we need new models that engage broader swaths of physicians and patients differently. And at Veradigm, we're working on something that we call the integrated research model. The integrated research model provides tools and workflows that seamlessly connect physicians and patients to the research process at the point of care. So what we're really working to do is extend capabilities of healthcare delivery platforms such as EHR, patient engagement, platforms that already exist today that could be leveraged to support additional workflows for research. This approach actually enables broader engagement of more of the non-traditional health delivery or health research organizations, extending beyond research centers where research is being done today, and really where much of that real world care is being delivered, like ambulatory and independent practices, consumer stores like Walmart with healthcare centers, minute clinics, and other things like that. So with probably the important thing here, with an integrated model, the research data becomes a thoughtful and natural output generated by the care process, rather than data that's plugged into a current process post hoc. One last thing I'll say though, and I've heard this talked about in a lot of other panels, in order for this approach to be successful, it really needs to happen at scale. There's a lot of pieces of this that are being done today. A lot of it being done in current research centers. I would say that in order for it to really work, it needs to be implemented at scale beyond the current research centers. And this is where large health tech, EHR, large other health tech and digital delivery companies can help with their scale to create an ecosystem where we can support these workflows on our platforms. Next slide. So obviously this is not going to happen overnight, but there are many opportunities for implementing this approach, this workflow approach, and some are already happening today. I've shown a partial list on this slide. I really want to focus on 3 here because it's something we're working on at Veradigm right now, and it illustrates an example of what I'm talking about. So I talk about protocol, physician, and patient matchmaking. Really, that is the real-time identification of patients matching study protocols at scale using the patient data. The one right below that is provider alerting physicians that they have patients available. And the third one is right below that, which is patient engagement. Utilizing platforms that we already have, patient portals, texting through the EHR, emailing through the EHR to engage patients in these research protocols. So putting those 3 together, it's a current existing platform that we have today. We're leveraging it in a new way to create an end-to-end process to identify, engage, and engage patients in trials. So the last point I want to make, and then I'll stop, is that digital healthcare delivery is evolving really rapidly. And so we need to, as an industry, we need to continually watch what's happening. I mean, Ian talked about, the scribe approach. That's a really interesting approach that I think, as we're developing our solutions, we have to be very agile. But I want to provide a real example that is happening today. So the last bullet on this slide lists virtual trials and remote patient monitoring. And so I wanted to share some data about the impact of COVID on telehealth, the care that we deliver through the Allscripts EHR platform. So go to the next slide. So on this slide, you're going to see 2 bar graphs. The top graph shows the number of telehealth sessions per day in May and June. That's the blue graph. The purple graph shows the number of telehealth minutes per day. And this is data from our Practice Fusion EHR platform. This represents about 30,000 independent and small ambulatory practices. The eye-opening statistic that you don't see in these graphs is, and it's not shown here, is that If I showed you these graphs for January and the beginning of February, they would be virtually zero. So zero telehealth sessions or minutes on the platform in January to today, where we are an average of 7,000 visits and 800 or 80,000 minutes per day of telehealth visits on this platform. The numbers are dropping a little bit with the reopening, but they're still consistently high. And the statistics on all of our other EHR platforms across Allscripts are similar. So this is a trend we need to pay attention to. So the folks that I talk to, both inside and outside of Allscripts, really think the genie is out of the bottle on telehealth. It's here to stay, and it's going to start getting much more sophisticated and feature rich with capabilities like remote patient monitoring. So this is a great example of an opportunity to rethink that whole virtual trial paradigm, virtualization of clinical research. If we, as we're building out our telehealth capabilities, if we integrate virtual research into this existing healthcare platform, which is already delivering telehealth and virtual care to patients at scale across the country, and we can do that rather than creating a completely separate virtual trial model. So with those thoughts, I think I'm probably out of time or over time, and I'll wrap my comments. Thanks for your attention today. I really appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Steph. I appreciate the comments, and thanks for sticking with us through the tough technical difficulties. So I'd like to come back to maybe some of those telehealth remote monitoring issues and how that has the potential to transform a lot of real world data and research. But let me start with going back to a few more basic issues. You all have made a pretty compelling case, building on things that we've seen already about the potential for some convergence between applied real world data for research purposes, for evidence development, and clinical care delivery. All of you are to some extent in both of those spaces now already. But I did want to, just as a sort of grounding us in reality, go back to some of the frameworks that we talked about yesterday and the general approach that FDA has been taking to its real world data and real world evidence framework, which starts with, really understanding the data and whether it's fit for purpose. And that means focusing on, at least the way most people have been thinking about it, focusing on specific purposes. So find an important question where maybe we're not sure because we haven't worked out all these details yet, but where we think the data that are available in real world settings could help us address the question, turn that into a case definition. And Brian talked about this a little bit, turn that into a case definition for what it is exactly that we want to study, a particular clinical problem in a particular clinical area, and then figure out what data elements are the minimum we need for that. And those data may not be perfect. Patrick talked about that on the last session. We can do a lot of work, and a lot of work is going on around issues like provenance and completeness and so forth, other issues that get at the validity of the data, and along with methods can help us learn whether these imperfections of the data are going to lead to just noise, or if they could really lead to important types of bias. But it really is taking this kind of universe and turning it into more specific applications. So I guess my question is, do you see in the particular areas you're working on some of the lead opportunities for applying that kind of framework? You have to start somewhere. We're not going to, we may not be able to use all of these data universally. They may not all be well understood enough for research purposes, maybe not for clinical purposes. I'm wondering if you could each talk a little bit about how we really get going from your standpoint. Where are the best opportunities to maybe find some of these cases and start building them out? And maybe Sam, we could start with you.
Yeah, happy to. And I think that's a fantastic framing. So in the world of matching, in a lot of ways, what we do looks a lot like the world of diagnostics. We're concerned about false positives, about false negatives. And ultimately, the performance of a match is going to be dependent that you choose is in how you manage those trade-offs of false positives and false negatives, sensitivity, specificity, is going to be dependent upon how that diagnostic or that match is ultimately going to be used. And so for folks I've worked with on the commercial side who are looking to track the utilization of on-market assets, understand and segment how those are being used and which populations use that to then direct their marketing and commercial operations. What they care about is sensitivity of getting as many data points as possible. And if there are matches or if there are data points that are wrong in the margins, usually the power of large numbers is enough to overpower that for their purposes, and something of the ballpark of a 95, 96% matching accuracy is sufficient. But as you start to look at real world evidence applications, particularly for populations with a very small n, either in a context of a clinical trial or places where you have a rare disease, then a errant data point that is matched into a small population can skew the results in ways that are not tolerated by the case in question. And so as you select your matching method, in those types of instances where you perhaps are more concerned about false positive matching, you may go for a more stringent method, which may somewhat constrain the population that you have at the end, but is going to be most appropriate for the research questions that you're looking to use. And so I think that it's important to recognize which elements of the work that we're doing are foundational. And much of what we're talking about here fits in that bucket. Improving the quality of data entry, which supports clinical care and also gives us more wiggle room as we select the appropriate method for matching our insights downstream. But it's also equally important to recognize where we have choice and where it's not an one-size-fits-all approach for answering a particular question, and making sure that, as Patrick noted, we are asking what is the right methods that will give us confidence around the question that we ultimately care about, and recognizing those may differ on the context.
Great, thanks. And Ryan?
Yeah, we actually, our approach is perfectly aligned with that. We take I describe, we would take a two-pronged approach here, where on one hand, we're looking at data fidelity, plausibility at a holistic global level, but at the scale that we're dealing with of 100 million patients, something like 35 billion clinical results, you can certainly get to a certain degree of fidelity around a data set, but you don't necessarily ever, no matter how much you refine that, don't ever get to the point where you're starting to apply the clinical utility questions. So in our world, we started with what I describe as both cardiovascular and then general population health, general medicine type questions to interrogate with the data. And then also have started with a couple of individual health systems who are parts of our network to ask those questions of. And that gives us kind of the 360-degree view of, you've got the scale of the data, but then you have health systems that really deeply, richly understand their own local data and can help point us in the right direction of, hey, this is how we make an interpretation of this phenotypic result. This is how we understand medications for patients that come from this clinic look. And we've started with a couple of sponsors who have, let's say, an appetite to kind of come on this journey with us, and an appetite to explore a potentially really rich data set and rich set of relationships. But then those site relationships then have given us the ability to go do things like chart reviews, both in a programmatic way as well as even like a manual spot checking way, all the way deeply down to really deeply understand a cohort and deeply understand the fidelity of the data that we're using to represent the cohort. So starting with CV, but know that there will be outgrowth from there as well.
Great, thank you. And Ian?
Yeah, I think the question is really, how do we all get started? From our point of view, I mean, I think the key to success here is getting deep clinical champions by specialty to really compel doctors to change behavior and get out of their what we call note ego and embrace new forms of standardization brought about by Augmetics. So we in fact have a number of specialty areas, customers, doctors in rheumatology and oncology that are holding hands with us to do precisely that, and really go beyond using us for time savings, burnout alleviation, and agree on new standard workflows so that they can have notes be structured similarly and registry ready, and so that we can remediate data deficiencies at the point of care with scribe support. So yeah, we're off into the races and eager to support more specialties and more EHR partners and more health system partners.
Great. And Steph, for the same question for you.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that was said. I'll just say for specific use cases where generally, we've gotten to today with real world data, the three things that we commonly get asked from our pharma research partners in the clinical trial space, the three things we get asked to do with our data are, number one is protocol optimization. So actually is that very narrow set of patients that they've defined for their trial, can they actually find patients that look like that, or enough patients that look like that? So that's a really good use of real world data right now in trials. The second is exactly what I mentioned in, I think in one of my slides, which is really that patient finding, matching patients, the patient matching protocols to patient characteristics and finding those patients. And the third, and I know there's a lot of talk about this, I don't know that anyone's really cracked the nut yet, but we're actually working on it as well, is the idea of a synthetic control arm for the large studies, for the placebo arm.
Thanks very much. And Brian, same to you. I know you've been thinking about this a lot and certainly cardiovascular and oncology.
I have, and I was about to share something very similar to what Steph just shared. The ability for real world data to I forget who said it, someone on the panel yesterday, the ability for it to wick away all of the clinical trialist work that they have to do prior to execution of a trial, identification, enrollment, all of that work. Real world data has, I think, a real opportunity to demonstrate value and making trials more efficiently designed and some of those initial steps in execution. So I think that's one area where we could get started right away, and some organizations are doing that pretty well. I think another area that you identified, Mark, particularly in reference to the FDA, is working with trials like, what Dr. Esmond's doing out in UCSF with the iSpy work, or with what Dr. Monica Bernoulli is doing with the iCare study. Identifying real world data approaches that can prove the validity and fidelity of the elements in those studies to meet the regulatory thresholds needed for the FDA, which is there's this real tension always between using real world data just for efficacy signal versus FDA using real world data for regulatory decision making. And there's a tension there that I think the closer we can prove that real world data meets the fidelity standards needed to make people, or to allow people to be comfortable within the FDA to make the regulatory decisions that they're charged with, I think that's another area to focus on. And that can be done in oncology, that can be done in cardiology, around a variety of use cases. And the final use case is the pandemic that we're in. The efforts that coalitions are coming together around, I have never seen it before. People are coming together, purely voluntary basis, defining what does a COVID-19 patient look like? What are the ways that we define severity as it relates to ventilation needs or ECMO needs, is fantastic. How people are coming together to define what those elements are, what the strict requirements are, and then to go out looking in EHR records, be them in Epic or Cerner or Allscripts or others, patients that meet those. And Stephanie, you brought up a great point, that last one, the control arm, the synthetic control arms for some of these studies. I think the ability for real world data to be leveraged for that cannot be overstated. That's something that we're actually pursuing with some of the researchers in convalescent plasma today, is identifying a synthetic control arm in the tens of thousands of patients to be matched to the patients with convalescent plasma that have gotten the treatment. So I think there's a lot of approaches here. Those are just a few of them that I can think of off my head.
Yeah, so lots of applications. Seems like we just need to roll up sleeves and partner with groups like these to get the work going. Let me stick with you for one more question along the same lines of defining these key questions to be answered, the use cases, the value use cases, so to speak. You've done a lot of work around data standards to support this. How much work is that as we start getting into these more sophisticated data capabilities? And what we've just been talking about are data from potentially a lot more sources coming together, which seems like would create issues around standardization. On the other hand, if we're getting more digital, maybe it's easier at the same time. So, and I'll ask some of the other panelists if they want to comment on this as well. Do we need fire standards for this? HL7 is the M-code model something that is needed in every case? How do we, what kind of standards are needed to make these additional use cases work with these very innovative ways of bringing together data?
So I'll tell you what my mentor, John Halamka, told me a while ago, which is that the technical effort is not hard. It's getting together data modelers and FHIR and building the value sets. It's the psychiatry behind it and bringing together the guiding coalition of people that are willing to agree on and adopt and test and pilot these standards, because a standard is only as good as the people that are willing to adopt it and the use case that is of value to the people that are adopting it. And so a lot of the hard work that goes behind the technical effort is really bringing together the right stakeholders that find value in what you're trying to do. A great example is pathways in oncology and the chimeric antigen receptor T-cell CAR-T therapies that cost an incredible amount, right? So how can we bring together the payers that are on the hook for paying that amount, the clinicians that want to use potential groundbreaking and impactful therapies to save patients' lives, and patients that obviously want to receive the therapy if it's appropriate for them? How can we bring them together in a use case that identifies the standards and the elements that help show the payers that it's worth the money, and the patients that it can help them, and the providers having a low level of effort to capture all that information? And so again, I come back to it's creating in a soup to nuts sort of way the coalition that can come around a use case, and the psychiatry that's needed is really the tough part in that. The technical part is, I mean, I don't mean to speak lowly of FHIR terminologies or anything. I'm one of them, but that effort is fairly straightforward. It's really the agreement that comes in the coalition itself that's the real challenging part, Mark.
And thanks, Brian. Let me ask the question. We're going to hear from John Halamka in a little while. But let me ask the other panelists if they'd like to comment on the same topic in terms of overcoming barriers to get going on more of these practical applications. Brian says, yeah, we need standards for the data, data protocols, data standards, but that's not really the biggest obstacle. What do you all see as key obstacles to address to move this work along?
Yes, so this is Steph. I can, there's a lot of great work being done. It's very hard to scale it. So ways to scale quickly. Probably every research center in this company is doing awesome work. It's just hard for them to move it out of their center and scale it across the country. So I think, we need to think about that problem, and it's from my perspective, it's an ecosystem problem. Just like we did with COVID, and we came together. Allscripts is part of the MITRE consortium, and it has been amazing. This really is, it's a multidisciplinary ecosystem where there's, a lot of players are involved, but I think the large health techs can really help with that scale problem because of the infrastructure that we have already at the point of care across the country.
Thanks. Any other comments?
I'll echo some of what's said. I take for granted that the standards will progress, thank goodness, but I'm much more concerned about catalyzing adoption and the financial, even downright financial incentives to make that catalytic action happen. And from my experience on Augmetics, I mean, just thinking about how Augmetics gets paid for, the varying mosaics of doctors and how they're employed, and money flows within health systems, and who's incented to advocate for what technology adoption or what form of standardization. It's an outright mess. And, anything we can do to streamline incentive structures within health systems and independence across health systems, all the various partners in the stack. I think that's critically important to get to adoption of standards and standardization and these protocols that are for sure iterating, and thank goodness they are.
The only thing I'd add to that is while there is benefit that can accrue through adopting the standards, we don't have the luxury of waiting for them. And so that means adopting, instead of waiting for everyone to speak the same language, starting to put in place the appropriate solutions to translate across different systems. And even short of having a standard format for data entry across all the systems, even if organizations start to reduce the degrees of freedom for a given input field, that supports on the back end to later normalize and curate that data, make it machine readable, even if folks are using different formats and standards across different groups.
And I think the benefits of adopting a standard always have to outweigh the cost of implementing the standard. We've seen a lot of attempts over the years of creation of a brand new standard, and then we find out, well, it's going to take a health system or a health IT provider. Let's use the health system example. It's going to take you 3 months to implement the technical infrastructure for a standard that will ultimately save you 15 minutes every time you do an activity once a quarter. So it's got to have benefit, and that's why we've worked really hard to use as much as possible the inherent platform capabilities that we've already made the investment in things like FHIR. So even though FHIR was not originally implemented as a quote unquote a research use case or an RWD utility standard, it's been something that we found utility in later on for RWD, and we've been able to piggyback on other work and use that standard.
And if we're gonna give some flexibility in terms of not trying to be too prescriptive and get too hung up on developing and then consistently applying specific standards, if different centers and so forth have different standards, that does seem like it puts some more burden, Ryan, as you were just saying, on the platforms for being able to demonstrate that, hey, we really are, we can trace the provenance of our data, we can show completeness, we can do the things that otherwise you might want to rely on standards for anyway, to the extent that standards were solving those problems. And that actually suggests a pretty significant role for some of these platform approaches in supporting real world data validation, it would seem. And any thoughts? Ryan, others? Yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
Absolutely. That's a part of the imperative on us is to, we work with roughly, depending on how you count it, 30 to 35% of inpatient beds and IDNs in the US at least. And so it's imperative on us then to be supportive of it. So I'm not suggesting that if a new standard came along that was beneficial and helped solve some of the data standardization problem, the normalization problem, the de-identification problem, we would certainly be on us to go do that. That's part of our role and our responsibility as a EHR provider. But I think that there's a lot of value to be mined from some of the standards we've already implemented and some extensions of those existing standards. We see things like clinical genomics have started to be baked into things like FHIR to support some of those use cases. So there's some existing interesting frameworks out there.
Other thoughts on this topic? I see some head nodding.
Yeah, so this is Steph. So just moving beyond the standards and touching on when you talk about, the platforms and platforms being important, I think they are actually really important. I talked about it being an ecosystem earlier, but typically, and we're at this point now, and digital healthcare is at this point, when you first start out, you get all these, new ideas and point-to-point solutions, and it's really the platforms that help pull all of those point-to-point solutions together in a way that make it broad and scalable. So I think that's important.
All right. I want to ask maybe one last question here on picking up on one of Steph's other points about the growing importance of telehealth, and I'd add remote monitoring in general. As you all said, that's and previous panels as well, lots of potential for additional data collection integration for clinical care and real world data for evidence. How do you all see special challenges in integrating that? Any additional comments that we haven't already covered with respect to bringing those types of data into the use of for real world evidence development?
One of the thing that strikes me, Mark, is that if you're, when we're doing telehealth and remote monitoring in the context of a care visit, then the data flows right back to the EMR. If we're going to do it separately as part of a trial virtualization, it probably isn't. To me, because this is really, COVID really catalyzed this thing called telehealth to really take off. It's a great place for us to create a beachhead, which is, creating a research pathway right in a care workflow that's being built as we speak and as we watch.
And it did change research, but a lot of that was pretty disruptive for the existing clinical research. So others want to comment on this topic?
Some very interesting learnings and takeaways from us. For one, in February, maybe less than 1% of Augmedix volume was over telemedicine. Today, maybe 2/3 is over telemedicine, and it's only small percent is over phone and glass. And of course, that will change over time, but telemedicine's here to stay. But the learning is this. When the telemedicine revolution started to explode in March, I think a lot of people said, maybe now that doctors are at home, they're on their computer, they can multitask more on those Zoom calls, and they can, they don't need so much deburdening support. We can add some more fields. What we've actually found out is the opposite. There's so much Zoom fatigue. It takes so much sort of sensory focus to be present on those Zoom calls and VC calls and AMWOL calls that if anything, doctors need more innovative forms of support to deburden them during those visits. So just a learning there. Solutions like Augmedix and otherwise are very much needed, if not more needed, in a telemedicine world than in the in-person world.
Okay. Any further final thoughts on this? A great discussion.
I was just going to offer just one comment, and it was more along patient remote monitoring, and that's that I think the current paradigm is one where EHRs are obviously leveraged by clinicians and used for documentation purposes and reporting purposes and billing purposes. And as we move more into this telehealth remote monitoring era with the pandemic kind of helping to reshape how we think about and practice medicine, the ability for patients to, I think, not only access, but, own their data. The ability for patients to be able to input device readings from their own, patient remote monitoring systems that they may have into their own record, I think is a change in that paradigm that we need to think about and figure out collectively how to navigate through that. I think EHR vendors, very importantly, need to have a voice at that table. And, it comes down to basic things like the FHIR questionnaire profile. How do we use that? What does that mean in terms of allowing patients the ability to input directly into their EHR record? And what voice does the clinician have in that as well? So I think there's a lot of unknowns here, Mark, that it's a brave new world, and look forward to navigating that collectively.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank all of you, Sam, Ryan, Ian, Steph, and Brian, for a great discussion as we head into this new world, maybe faster because of the pandemic than some may have expected, for a really good discussion. This tees us up in the next session for putting that ecosystem together. Picking up on Ian's comments, since telehealth and maybe like teleconferences like this one are a little bit exhausting, we're going to take a 2-minute break, restart at 3:40 with our final panel of the day. Thank you all very much for an excellent discussion. I'd like to welcome you all back for our 5th and final session for this web event on next steps towards establishing a high-quality real-world data ecosystem. So during this session, we're going to focus on what next steps might look like for building a data ecosystem that provides value to a wide range of stakeholder needs. We talked about this topic in the last session, with a focus on how a lot of increasingly sophisticated pieces and potential for putting together an ecosystem are there. And I think just a brief summary of some of the panelists' perspectives was it's not the standards, it's not the particular technical details that are at issue. It's really bringing together the stakeholders around some of these emerging unprecedented opportunities for using high quality real world data for evidence development. And so we've touched on these issues throughout the day. We've got the building blocks, new tools, common understanding of data quality and characterization and the like. And what's needed is perhaps increasing cultural and institutional awareness and of not only what the opportunities are at scale, but what the specific steps are that are needed to get there. We've talked about financial incentives. We've talked about regulatory barriers and incentives. We've talked about other opportunities to develop a shared consensus and shared momentum around addressing these issues. In the last panel, on the first day, we talked about how COVID-19 has created unprecedented pressure in some ways to bring different sources of data together to answer questions about a pandemic that we simply hadn't faced before. So it's clear that commitment is needed to align approaches, and further steps are needed to provide the right incentives and infrastructure support from across the health system, but also clear that we seem to have some unprecedented opportunities to do all of that. So for this last panel on these big picture questions, we're very honored to have of health system leaders who will help us navigate these topics and find a path to the next steps towards getting to scale for this kind of high quality real world data ecosystem. Our speakers include Michael Vasconcelos, who's Chief Medical Officer, Research and Regulatory at Flatiron Health, Zubin Apin, Chief Medical Officer at HealthCorp, and John Halamka, President of the Mayo Clinic Platform. And for those of you who are watching, once again, you can send us questions via email at margolisevents, at Margolis to margolisevents.duke.edu, and can also tweet hashtag RWE for participation, hashtag for our RWE ecosystem, hashtag RWD ecosystem, can't even read what's on the screen, for those of you who are participating via Twitter. So we're gonna start with Michael, so I'd like to go ahead and turn to you. Michael, thanks.
Mark, thank you very much. It's been great these last couple of days being part of the conference. I wanted to thank the Duke Margolis organizers for the opportunity. It's really a pleasure. I feel like the last Q&A session in a way was sort of a slipstream effort right into this session. I thought many of the summary comments were spot on. And maybe just by way of brief introduction, as a physician, hematologist, oncologist, I spent most of my career as a cancer researcher and drug developer, and so it's been a real opportunity for me to work at Flatiron Health for the last several months, sort of converging health technology and oncology research in, I think, really critically important ways. You know, we're in a nice position. We have a line of sight to healthcare providers and patients, and then I think are intimately involved in really important research questions that really historically were very difficult to ask with the kind of data and the questions we've applied to those data over the last several years. I think, you know, if we were to think about bringing together a group of experts to opine on building a high quality ecosystem in real world data, I think we've pretty much hit it out of the park with this conference. I've tried to listen carefully over the last couple of days and just maybe would like to reinforce a couple of themes that I've heard, Mark, you share already as you've walked us through today's session. But three takeaways for me that I think should center us in terms of those next steps really are, keeping patients at the center, which has always been a North Star for all of us, and thinking about the right stakeholders to continue to participate, which is more complex in some respects in this arena. And then an area that I was pleased to hear a little bit more about today that I didn't hear quite as much yesterday around, which is the importance of clarity from a regulatory and policy standpoint to really help continue to engender the kind of innovation and investment that this space needs. So in terms of keeping patients at the center, I think Leslie Curtis and Jacqueline Corrigan-Curry did a terrific job setting the stage for that yesterday, thinking about measurements that matter in a transparent way. And I was particularly intrigued by Laura Esserman's comments yesterday in that respect, to really challenge us to think about the process of the way in which care is delivered and the convergence of care and clinical research, which I think is a theme that's resonated then through the entire conference. That's been reinforced in different ways by Paul Friedman and some of the really interesting work that he summarized in terms of bringing in clinicians to understanding the data that they're helping provide in the day-over-day care of their patients. And then today, in sessions 3 and 4, whether it's work that really was focused on improvements in the EHR that around information that's already there, or Ian's comments around the work at Augmetics and Stephanie's comments about her integrated research strategy. All of those, to me, at the end of the day, the crux of that really distills down to a patient-focused effort. In terms of stakeholders, I think one of the things that I want to just underline is it's not just the usual suspects that we think about in terms of clinicians, researchers, patients at the center there as well, but also real expertise in engineering and social scientists that I think that point was made yesterday with respect to how we think about building systems that focus on data interface with the human experience. I think the work that the Spotlight COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator project really highlighted yesterday was terrific, because it shows that you have a sense of urgency and you bring the right people together, and meaningful observations can be made really very, very quickly. At the outset yesterday, we talked about the FDA framework. Mark, you referenced it back again with respect to real world evidence. And I think there I'd want to underline a thought to keep in mind as we talk about next steps for this high quality ecosystem. And that is thinking about the health tech and research institutions like Flatiron Health that really need to help shape what those next steps look like, and thinking about really tangible and specific ways in which FDA in particular in this example can create those opportunities that maybe historically didn't have to be thought of quite to the level of granularity as we're facing now. And then, like I mentioned at the outset, I think I was a little bit chagrined yesterday. I didn't feel like the sort of underpinning fundamentals for continued investment and innovation were quite as clear, but today I think we hit it out of the park there. And I think there was a lot of really robust conversation around the importance of standards, the role they play in really creating a foundation that all of us then can continue to operate in and continue to innovate. I think there were really nice examples of that yesterday in terms of some of the continuous patient generation of data that Andy Corvus shared with us, and I think the examples continued all through today. So I think as we move through the rest of the session, keeping patients at the center, making sure that all the stakeholders' voices are meaningfully heard, and making sure that we continue to drive the kind of baseline foundation that we all need, so that the investment in innovation will continue, I think are the three tenets that are really important to me.
Great. Thanks very much, Michael. And that's also a great summary of some of the themes. So it saved me a little time at the end as well. Zubin, I'd like to go to you next.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much. And thank you to you and the Margolis team for putting together just a great 2-day session. All of these sessions are so informative, productive, and thrilled to be part of this. I think, Michael, you did a terrific job of framing up this conversation and bringing us down the home stretch. I think, really thinking about putting patients at the center and who are all the stakeholders who can help do that for this ecosystem are the two key themes to discuss here. I serve as Chief Medical Officer of HealthCore, which is an independently operating subsidiary of Anthem, the health insurance plan. And through that relationship, we are able to do clinical research, both prospective and retrospective clinical research, using all the claims that Anthem has historically, which is on north of 73 million lives. And with active membership has 43 million lives with claims data. And why is this important? I think the claims data can provide a terrific contribution to this ecosystem in terms of thinking about longitudinal data and important outcomes for our patients and the drugs and devices and treatment strategies we might use to improve those outcomes. Clearly, we have great data as it relates to resource utilization and cost, but I think increasingly what we're trying to do is figure out how can we broaden the characterization of our members beyond just the claims data. And as such, I think this ecosystem conversation is very important. Certainly, we have tried to do things in a centralized manner on our 43 million members to be able to get data beyond just the claims data. As an example, we have worked with electronic health record companies to be able to get data starting with the CCD and now have that data on north of 4.4 million lives, which we can use for research. And this for HealthCore is important not only for the retrospective health and economics outcomes research we might do or the safety and epidemiology research we might do, but increasingly we are also deploying those clinical data on top of our claims data for pragmatic clinical trials. That could mean making sure that we have the appropriate patients from the clinical data being used for inclusion exclusion criteria, all the way to using the claims data in concert to actually adjudicate and collect endpoints in a very cost-efficient manner. We are also trying to collect data, including social determinants of health data, and have worked to internalize and centralize a lot of that. But as you can imagine, one strategy can be to take a centralized strategy and try to acquire everything yourselves. Another is to be a part of that ecosystem and work with other players, particularly as we start to think more and more about interoperability. And we've been delighted to work with companies, including ones that have been participating today, such as DataVant, to think about how we might be able to match our claims data at a patient level without exchanging PHI and obtain clinical data on the same patients. And in doing so, we've been able to create large-scale registries, such as oncology registries that combine clinical and claims data on north of 300,000 patients across 22 tumor types. So thinking about the oncology lens, particularly yesterday, we're trying to bring our claims data to bear to create a more holistic picture of these patients. So I think that is a terrific opportunity for us in this. And the last thing I would just say is the payers are a very invested stakeholder and should be a very invested stakeholder in a real world data ecosystem. In addition to being able to contribute data that might be meaningful for longitudinal assessment of patients, such as our claims data, there's a vested interest for health plans to be able to participate and get some of this clinical data back and participate in this bidirectional sharing. As an example, the clinical data that we get from electronic health records, and the reason why it's important for us to be able to see some of that, helps us reduce our spend and our investments on health plan operations, such as fulfilling HEDIS, gap closure, risk adjustment, and other health plan operations. And in doing so, that helps hopefully reduce the cost of operations for a health plan, but also savings can be shared back to the providers who are participating in that data sharing. And ultimately, that combined data of clinical and claims data can be used for data sharing purposes. And on the last note, I think, just going back to Michael's comment about putting patients in the center, we want to think about how do we continue to add to our claims data, again, starting with the clinical data that we've talked about so much here, but think about more patient-centered and ambulatory data as well, whether it's some of the sensors and devices that we talked about yesterday, but also the patient-reported outcomes measures and patient-generated data that are important for us to be able to assess not only quality of life, but other meaningful outcomes for our patients. Certainly working with personal health records and being able to get input from patients and combine that patient-generated data with our claims data is one avenue. But we have a very big survey-eligible cohort where we're hoping to bring those novel types of data in as well. So hopefully the claims data is one contribution we can bring to the ecosystem to hopefully make a more holistic characterization of these patients in the effort of a real-world data ecosystem that can drive outcomes for our patients. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Zubin. Really appreciate the comments too. And next I'd like to turn to John Halamka. Thanks, John.
Well, great. So what a great discussion thus far. And of course, we all have to agree with this patient centricity. Remember, I'm at Mayo Clinic now, where the notion is the patient always comes first. So when we start thinking about real world data on gathering evidence, how can you gather a large corpus of data, make it available to investigators and innovators, but also use it in ethical ways that is feeling to not just HIPAA or GDPR or the California Consumer Privacy Act, but to all our patients as an appropriate use of data. So I joined Mayo January 1, and this was one of the first challenges that I was handed. Mayo Clinic has 30 petabytes of EHR structured and unstructured data, but it also has 25 million pathology slides, 30 million biological samples, hundreds of petabytes of images, waveforms, and non-traditional data. So what did we decide to do to establish this ecosystem of real-world data and make it available? And this, Mark, is where I have to be slightly careful because we partnered with Google. Now, I just need to make sure everybody knows Google does not have access to the data, right? Because sometimes when you say we partnered with Google, they say, oh, what, you got a petabyte drive and you shipped it off to Mountain View? No. Here's how we decided to do it. We hired a company called Inference. We worked with Brad Malin at Vanderbilt. We worked with the Office of Civil Rights. And we said, well, what does de-identification really mean in the context of existent law and regulation nationally, but also at a state level and internationally? We then recognized that HIPAA identifiers, 18 of them, really aren't sufficient if you're thinking of the ethical use of de-identified data for all kinds of real-world evidence analytics. So we came up with this notion of bin size and denominators. If I said there's this famous guy who used to be at the FDA who's now associated with Duke, I did not use a single HIPAA identifier, but everybody on this call could figure out who I was referring to. So we actually had to look at what were the denominators, and we decided in consultation with the Office of Civil Rights, a denominator of 10 would be sort of sufficiently de-identified that you could use this data for all types of investigation and research without requiring a variety of sort of special additional protections. But what do? With Google, we created a series of closed containers that were hosting the de-identified data in a FHIR-enabled API where we could invite an analytics firm or a analyst who thought that they would be doing some great things for research into the Mayo Clinic cloud, into this Google Cloud platform where they could access the de-identified data, and it would never leave Mayo control. The only thing that would ever leave would be the analytics, the result, the algorithm. And so our notion was de-identify it, certify as de-identify it, control it, and only exfiltrate analytics and results. And Mayo did this, went live in April with our first 10 petabytes of structured data. We're now adding unstructured data. We're adding images. We're adding omics. Now omics, there's another issue. So Mark, what if I published your 3 billion base pairs? HIPAA didn't say anything about your DNA. It's got to be safe, right? Oh, wait a minute. HIPAA was written in 1996. It didn't mention flying cars either. Right? So what we said was, what is culturally the expectation on omics? Same principle. De-identified to the point where what you're showing is got a bin size or denominator sufficient that it's not going to identify an individual. And so we could publish a biomarker And so we're now adding all of these biological samples and omics into this de-identified data set. And so I tell you all that because for us, the notion of real world data is start with a set of technologies, a closed cloud, encrypted data at rest, FHIR interfaces, and invite individuals into it who you certify. But then beyond that is adding novel sources of data, right? We've all been talking about this. Patient-generated data, both objective and subjective. Data that you may gather from your phone, data from surveys, data from wearables, and those add to this corpus of data. And Mayo has started a couple of other interesting activities, this acute care in the home, which also generates data more of a continuous nature around certain diseases, and a mechanism of ingesting data from a variety of novel sources, including ingesting things like images from external sites and turning those into radiation oncology, auto-contouring profiles, and care plans. So in summary, our notion is create the technology, create the policy, create the cultural expectations, communicate to everybody what you're doing, and then, of course, you have a platform for the collection and use of real-world data in ethical ways. The last thing we're doing is we are convening a conference, and not yet do we have a date. We'll be virtual like this one. We're going to bring together thought leaders like you to really talk about things like consent and ethical use of data as we gather all these different data types and make them available for aggregate, de-identified use by multiple stakeholders. Turn it back to you.
All right, thanks for that, and I'm glad to still be de-identified in your database. I haven't actually gotten care at Mayo, so probably not in there to begin with, at least not yet. John, thanks for those comments, and I don't want to preempt your upcoming conference, which sounds very much needed, but I do want to push you all a little bit on some of these topics related to getting to an ecosystem. So let me start with what people have said over the last couple of days is most important is this notion of patient or person centricity. And maybe you could ask for just a few more steps in order to get there. And just to tee that up, it still seems like we've got the aim, but we're not there yet. I'm recalling everything from some of the comments that Shea made earlier at the work that they're doing at Verana Health, where when they're trying to bring in and validate the data that they're getting from their ophthalmologist, they have to be careful because some ophthalmologists talk about not the patient's left eye or the right eye, but what's on the ophthalmologist's left side or right side. So everything from that to these ecosystems that may be formed for topics that aren't maybe quite directly related to and reflective of patients' highest priorities. So what are the next practical steps to get to more patient person centricity as the culture that really drives all of this work and hopefully helps motivate people? I mean, after all, that's the core of what's motivating clinicians in their care, is the core of what's motivating a lot of this research to get to better treatments for patients. Yet we don't seem to be have come together all the way behind this vision of patient centricity yet. Where do we need to go next? Anybody want to start?
So, hey, I'll start just because this is a controversial, geeky informatics issue. So several of you, I think, were probably on the Pew Charitable Trust group that looked at patient matching, identity management, bringing together data from multiple sources around an individual. And this is, of course, extraordinarily tough. And the likelihood that we're going to have a national patient identifier in our lifetime, probably not so great, but a nationwide patient matching strategy, maybe. And so one of the things that Mayo is working on, and many others, is asking the question mark of how is it, if you've got these multiple different data sources, can you use a privacy-preserving identity management function that allows you to aggregate this data into a longitudinal patient record, which then can be used for analytics? I do not highlight any company. I have no conflicts of interest, but I will tell you that my buddy Jeff Jonas, Jonas, and Mark, you probably worked with him back when we were working with Carol Diamond, was asked by the Las Vegas casinos, could he provide a longitudinal high roller experience showing where people were betting and winning without disclosing who the individual was? And he used hashes and creative ways of privacy preserving but aggregating. He then became IBM's head of identity management, and now he's formed a spin-out company from IBM called Sensing, which is a bunch of APIs for bringing together longitudinal data in a privacy preserving way, and he's given a whole lot of the stuff away for free. So certainly that's a big issue to solve.
Yeah, thanks for the emphasis on identity management, and if we can solve it in the casinos, it sounds like maybe there's a way to do privacy preserving versions of it for healthcare. Zubin, Michael, comments on this?
Yeah, no, I think, John, you won't
We don't
find
have
me.
to comment on the casinos. It's I meant that
I was going to say, you won't find me in that log, so you don't have to worry about me being there. I'm at the $5 tables. But I think we are certainly on the same page around the identity management piece. I think a lot of what we spoke about, particularly with combining clinical and claims data for purposes like that oncology real-world registry that I talked about, is very much in terms of privacy preservation and managing identities, particularly through tokenizing and hashing these patients so that their patient's PHI is not exchanged across different entities. Now, having said that, I think it's important to think about how you might still be able to identify individuals. And John, I think you went through sort of a great example there. I think the other part, Mark, to answer your question, I think is very important, is that we do involve the patient as the primary stakeholder. And I think that brings together both of what the comments that Michael made in terms of, number one, putting the patient in the center, but also thinking about the stakeholders. The patient, to me, is the primary stakeholder. And we've tried to really think about how do we engage our patients in the clinical research that we might participate in because of the data that we have on these patients. And so some of the studies that we are currently outreaching for, including those in atrial fibrillation, that go directly to the patient, and also through sites, pragmatic clinical trials in rheumatoid arthritis, COPD, diabetes. All of these obviously obtain patient consent, but increasingly we are trying to make sure that we make sure patients are aware of these opportunities to participate in research. And somebody showed the slide earlier where most patients never understand what research opportunities are available to them that they could participate in, not only to advance their care, but the care overall of the population. So thinking about how do we involve our members, make sure they understand what the study opportunities are, target those opportunities based off of what we know about the patient, but do it in a privacy preserving manner is a key for us to involving the patient.
Michael?
Yeah, a couple things I'd just add, or I guess underscore. I really appreciated John leading with a dialogue around keeping privacy first and foremost, as the world of what we're doing in terms of data aggregation is more and more complex, and some of the foundations that we've built that on are really at all didn't contemplate what we're able to do today. And I really applaud the Mayo for being leaders there, and I think it's something we all need to pay attention to. That has a patient centricity focus to it, absolutely. The other thing I'd just highlight is a comment that came up yesterday, and then some solutions today around really thinking about patient care, and especially some of the clinicians on this conference got a bit animated, talking about how, with all best intentions, some of our tech solutions have gotten in the way of that. And I think we really, really need to, remain conscious of that. It's really our duty and obligation as we really move in service to the next question, which is a more macro question about how care on an aggregate basis can be improved. And there, I think the themes around converging the use of clinical data and sort of the historic use of clinical research into new and novel ways is, it feels to me very much on the precipice of what we're going to be able to do as we think about an RWD ecosystem of the future that's high quality. I mean, in a very small example at Flatiron Health, we've been able to implement a low-lift, non-interventional study that has real meaning for clinicians and patients that in a community-based setting that has really, by any metric or measure, been wildly successful and more straightforward than I think we would have imagined, having not had the opportunity to do that before this first example. And it's really galvanizing our thinking about how the ecosystem that we have in place with many oncologists and the tools that we provide to help them deliver optimal care can be further enhanced, not just by the sort of approach that we've taken historically in terms of improving quality of care and research through the use of de-identified data, but then starting to leverage the whole ecosystem in new ways that will be beneficial. So when I say patient centricity, those are the themes that I think about.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's a really useful and practical approach to what patient centricity actually means in the context of real world data ecosystems. And just to recap a bit what I've heard, first of all, questions that the real world data are being put together for these use cases that are questions that really matter to patients. And that, in principle, shouldn't be that hard. That's what clinicians care about too. And that's why we're trying to develop better products and better evidence in the first place, but certainly that's front and center. But you all have also, I think, appropriately emphasized privacy. And while these are technical methods that that John talked about, having communication strategies around them so that there's no surprises there, and people understand that there are ways to secure their privacy as part of these efforts, seems very important. I want to raise a third that has been touched on during the day, and I got a couple of questions about it from participants in today's webinar too. And please keep sending those in to Margolis events at duke.edu. And that's the issue of what's the term I want to use here? Not exploitation, that's a bit strong, but people do have, there is a lot of cynicism out there that this isn't really about them, but it's about data being used for making money off them or something like that. And does that I think people have a very high level of respect, as we've talked about, for research and for learning and doing better, but there are a lot of commercial interests involved in this too. And does that play into how to present and how to develop, because we're building it in a real world data ecosystem that addresses that kind of concern among the public as well?
So why don't I start with that? So Mark, again, I've been at Mayo for 6 months. And one of the things you first get when you come to Mayo is the Mayo Bible. And
I think we're actually going to see it now.
and so what this tells you is the values by which all decisions at Mayo are made. And you can see at the top, the patient always comes first. And then there's a series of other values that have been around for 155 years. So I tell you that because it's amazing. If you walk up to a janitor at the Mayo Clinic and you ask, what are the values of the organization? That person will be able to tell you. It's a culture based on everyone being a participant in supporting the values. And therefore, when we make decisions on collaboration on real world data, we actually ask, well, so how will this be used? Is it treatment? Is it cure? Is it going to alleviate suffering due to disease? Is it quality? Is it safety? Right? And so to the point is, okay, fine, there may be value creation, right? You've invented a new medication that saves lives and you sell it. That's okay, right? But it's aligned with the values of the organization and trying to alleviate the suffering caused by disease. So I guess I would answer your question if that's really not a legal or technical question, it's a cultural question. And at Mayo, the culture and its imperative is very clear.
Zubin, Michael, culture important for creating these real world data ecosystems, and how do we get to the right culture for them?
It is, and I think that clearly we're in a very mission-oriented sector overall. So I think it's important for all of us in healthcare to make sure that we have the right culture and that, exploitation never is really part of this. We have recently undertaken sort of an exercise across enterprise to really think about our culture and what is important to us. And one thing that is certainly clear for Anthem is that it's important that we value the communities that we serve as well as our members who live in those communities. And we touch 1 in 7 Americans, so we have a very broad reach across our 14 states that we serve. So I think it's important for us to think about how do we make sure that we're always using the data in the patient's best interest. Part of it is what I talked about with, how do we involve patients in the research and make sure that they're driving some of the decisions in terms of how their data might be used. Member or patient abrasion is something that we think very carefully about, and making sure that we do not increase member abrasion for the sake of some short-term opportunity is something that I think we need to be very mindful of. I think in addition to thinking about, how do we actually generate evidence for our patients and involve them in that, there's also the opportunity for us to think about how do we create value for our members and make sure that, those efforts to drive value of care, whether it's improving quality or reducing cost, come through some of these data sharing exercises that we talked about. And so thinking about, for example, how these data might be used not only to generate evidence, but implement evidence and guidelines in value-based contracts, value-based agreements, I think is another important part of what I haven't touched upon so far. But having the clinical data in addition to the claims data is very important for us to be able to say the drugs and devices that we've studied in the clinical trials that we know are recommended by guidelines. We want to make sure, number one, that our patients are getting them, and number two, that they're as safe and as effective in this real world population as was demonstrated in the clinical trial. And being able to do that and then attribute benefit or risk through having the data and adjudicating outcomes, I think is important, not only for the business, but it's aligned with the patient's incentives. We want to make sure that they're getting the treatments that they deserve.
Great, thanks. And Michael, and I'm going to come back to the payment issue in a minute, but Michael?
Well, I don't have my Flatiron Health Bible to share with everyone, but what I will just underline is that culture is absolutely necessary. I personally don't think it's sufficient because you have to reduce that to practice day over day in terms of how the institution shows up, how it behaves, how it behaves inside its 4 walls, and how it projects itself externally. And that's fundamental, and it's clear that all of us ascribe to that and can help maintain that reality wherever we operate day over day.
Great, thank you. And so I do want to shift to, we've talked about culture, patient centricity, and we've talked about what we're trying to build in terms of an ecosystem that you all described, virtual registry, these integrated data approaches that can keep getting better. I want to talk about the supports for that from a policy standpoint, and that usually means payment issues and regulatory issues. So starting with payment, it does seem easier from a aligned financial support standpoint to put these kinds of ecosystems together if the underlying payments on the healthcare side and the underlying payments for supporting the real world evidence development are also really about people. We've heard earlier today and yesterday some of the challenges caused by fragmentation of payments, by just on the last panel, physicians having to use their EMRs to document the length of a visit, and other specific details above and beyond what they'd like to put in there was truly a patient-focused nexus, as we heard on the earlier panel today too. What kinds of payment supports or what kind of payment obstacles are there? Do you see help coming from alignment with the goals of payers as well? And Zubin, maybe I'll start with you on this one, since you brought up the issue of a value-based payment, as I think, as opposed to fee-for-service or something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm personally very enthusiastic and have been for a while around the value-based agreement or contract as being a vessel by which we align incentives that, number one, help us with this data sharing issue and creating the real world data ecosystem, but number two, having us continue to drive to the best outcomes in the most efficient manner for our patients. That's why I joined CareMore, which is a care delivery organization owned by Anthem that not only ensures patients but takes care of them. But increasingly, we're seeing that we need to have those kind of value-based agreements broadly across the enterprise. And certainly, Anthem has taken the stance of promoting value-based agreements, and in doing so, making sure that bidirectional data sharing is part of the contract that goes into those value-based agreements. So having electronic health record data come back to us and be able to, for us to share data back not only streamlines operations and reduces costs of low-hanging fruit like utilization management and prior authorization, it also helps us with the things that we need to work together on. For example, the HEDIS and the gap closure and risk adjustment items that I mentioned. But ultimately, I think it's also important for us to have this ecosystem for us to think about the emerging devices and treatments. So while there may be the provider and the payer as counterparties in a value-based contract or agreement, it's also important for us to think about the value-based contracts that a payer/PBM with a pharmaceutical company might have as counterparties, and thinking about how do we take a new drug that has price X and be able to share risk, understand what outcomes are attributable to the drug. Do they have the same kind of benefits that we saw in the clinical trial, whether that population was representative of the population that we serve? And then being able to share risk or value, I think, is important, but we need the data to be able to do that. And so I think the value-based contract is a great vehicle to align those incentives, no matter who the counterparties are, but the payer certainly is one of those counterparties, whether it's with the pharmaceutical company or with the providers themselves.
So in that example, less data about prescribing volume and what drives it and what might increase it, and more data about impact of the pharmaceutical on the population and that sort of thing.
That's a great point.
Michael, John?
Well, so here's an interesting comment on regulatory change. On January 15th, Mayo was seeing 50 patients virtually a day. On April 15th, Mayo was seeing 7,000 patients virtually every day. And that, of course, was necessity, right? Because we were all delivering care at a distance. But it was also regulatory reform and waivers that said, oh, we're going to actually pay you for remote patient monitoring, for the gathering of novel sources of data in the home, for the delivery of virtual care. So what this meant was a realignment of the way payment is delivered means that we can gather more data and use this data that we're gathering in novel ways. So there's no question that the power of alignment of incentives is very potent.
Michael, any thoughts on this one?
I have nothing to add at this moment. I would love to see a more robust, drawn out discussion around this question as it relates to building a real world data ecosystem, because as altruistic and as mission based as all of us are in this field, there's no question that aligning those incentives will be helpful to achieving our mission. So I look forward to that.
And what does that mean? You see, Michael, is that every one of us now has, in our home, you got your blood pressure, you got your wearable pulse ox, and so the point being is that think of real world evidence and real world data. I was diagnosed with primary hypertension 2 years ago, and now I can tell you when I take my pill, what the dose is, what my blood pressure is, what my activity is, what my pulse ox is, and make that available to the healthcare system for analytics.
Yeah, it sounds easier than someone calling you up to collect the data that may not be quite so accurate, or getting a scribe for an electronic record transcription. Let me shift over to, and we should come back to that, and I promise we'll keep working on this at Duke Margolis. Sounds like John and the rest of you will be too. Let me switch over to the regulatory side. So we've talked some about issues around HIPAA and privacy protection for research, at least research that involves potential non-trivial risk or differential impact on a patient. There also are consent procedures and lots of other issues involved. If we are really getting this alignment and a convergence between clinical care and real-world data used for research as well as clinical care, do we need to rethink our regulatory framework there?
I personally don't think we need to rethink it. I think we're on a really nice path. I think that we need to continue the dialogue and we need to all learn together. Flatiron Health has really been now for several years working closely with a variety of regulatory agencies, in particular FDA, and that's been an incredibly fruitful collaboration. Others have as well. We have stakeholders like Duke Margolis and others who have really helped bring that dialogue together. My sense is that we're at the point where I think and this was alluded to in the last in the last Q&A session, that there are real opportunities for the use of the data to help answer important questions in a regulatory context. I think we need to continue to refine the appropriateness of those use cases as not just issues around the data itself progress with respect to all the issues of quality that have been touched on here, but also candidly, some of the methodologic and analytic challenges are also addressed. And if we do that together in partnership, I think we'll get there to find the right added benefit that a more complex data set will bring in a regulatory context.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, this is an important question. And John and I were on a panel together at National Academy of Medicine. And John, I'm sure you'll have a lot to add here. But one thing that was discussed quite a bit from a regulatory standpoint is thinking about HIPAA in particular and what we need to do to potentially update that, given sort of how it's dated, as John alluded to. But certainly thinking about who's classified and how do you define covered entities in 2020, I think is important, as well as how do you make sure that you take individually identifiable health information and protect that and make sure that it can be amended or deleted by individuals choosing. So I think thinking about how that data is being used, who has access to that data, how covered entities are defined moving forward, and how we're going to start thinking if we really promote interoperability and companies like the ones that manufacture the devices that John showed have access to some of the data that is clinically useful, but also might need to be protected. How do we make sure that legislation protects individuals' rights as it's shared more broadly across different organizations that are entering into this ecosystem?
All right, so two thoughts. I think we know from the interoperability and from the information blocking rules from ONC and CMS that there's going to be more patient stewardship of their own data. And this is controversial, but I talked to Judy Faulkner about those rules specifically. And to be honest, she had no issue with the cost or complexity of implementing them. It was her worry that as soon as data leaves any HIPAA control, that a patient might not read an end user license agreement, which is 9 pages long and 4-point type, may download their data into an app that shares it in ways that they are not comfortable with, that doesn't respect their preferences. So I think we just need to sort of think of it. Do we have that regulatory framework in place, assuming that a patient is an equal participant in the data ecosystem? Second comment I would make is that in a time of COVID, I would say we have a moral imperative to find cure and accelerate vaccine research. And I would also just ask, do we have those right frameworks in place to make sure that we can use data respectfully and ethically, but also use it in ways that will accelerate discovery? Granular consent enforcement is just really, really hard. And that's one of the reasons we want to have this conference and ask, is there something we can do at a more infrastructure level rather than requiring very complicated consent models to ensure we empower research and discovery?
Thank you. And, we covered a lot of topics related to vision for what an ecosystem focused on patients, focused on people would look like, and the culture that needs to go along with it, the policy supports, the content. As we wrap up, any final thoughts, comments you'd like to make before we get to, before we finish this session that would help us get to this better type of ecosystem? Anything else you'd like to add?
So last thing I'll say is data provenance, especially in a virtual care world, will be increasingly important. So I happen to be wearing a device from Withings that measures pulse, pulse ox, and activity. What's its precision and accuracy? Should you call an ambulance if it says my pulse is 20? Does anyone have any idea? Right? So as we get more and more novel data, I think as a country, we better understand the appropriate uses and where that data, in fact, is reasonable and believable and not.
Thank you.
Hey, John, that's a great point. And the only thing I'd add is, we've talked a lot about the culture, the ethics, certainly the tech that it can allow for this ecosystem to flourish. I think it's going to be important for us to make sure that we implement the right study designs once we have this real world data ecosystem. And certainly other speakers have talked about this, but being able to randomize and make sure that we have trials embedded within the system to use the data with the provenance that John just mentioned, I think is going to be key. So I want to make sure we don't miss re-emphasizing study designs and the right ones to find safe and effective treatments.
Thank you. Michael, any final thoughts?
No, I think it's been a great discussion, and I'm going to make sure that we have time to wrap up properly.
Okay, and I'm gonna do that wrap up right now very quickly. But before I do, want to thank all three of you, Zubin, Michael, John, for taking the time this afternoon to help us end on with a lot of momentum for the future. Certainly some big challenges ahead, but boy, especially in the era of COVID-19, an era where we're seeing such big disparities in our health system that we really need to not only understand and observe, but do something about more effectively. This seems like the time for progress on real world data for better evidence. Thank you all very much for the panel this afternoon. And I'd like to add to that by thanking everyone who's been with us yesterday and today on for this web event on establishing a high quality real world data ecosystem. We know how busy your schedules are these days, and this is a different world that we're operating in with respect to doing things virtually. So it's still a format that we're getting used to, but I think thanks to everyone's participation, including the comments that we received via our email and Twitter, it's been quite a stimulating dialogue as well. So I want to thank you all for your participation. This is not the end of the effort towards making progress on real world data and real world data ecosystems. We're going to continue to work with all of you and the broader stakeholder community to work to these goals. But for now, I'd like to move to some thank yous. First, thanks to those who were generous with their time to share thoughts throughout all of our sessions yesterday and today. Our esteemed group of speakers and panelists, their remarks and insights on these very important but quite complex and evolving topics were invaluable for our work in this event. And next, I'd like to thank our collaborators at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. FDA is always a place that's busy, that's at the center of what matters to Americans and frankly for public health around the world, probably no more so than now. I know you can always say that, but we really appreciate all of their efforts in shaping today's discussion. And I'd like to specifically thank Jacqueline Corrigan-Correa, David Martin, Diane Peralin, and Care Elzerad, sorry. And I'd also like to extend our thanks to our planning group of national experts who provided the guidance, the leadership, and the support for developing the agenda and putting this all together today. Without their help, we wouldn't have been able to pull this off. And so that includes Marika Bertinoli, Laura Esserman, Sam Roos, and Leslie Curtis, who served in a number of capacities as a speaker, a moderator, and a core member of our planning group. And last, I'd like to thank our team at Duke-Margolis, Adam Atten, Nick Harrison, Adam Croach, Marta Wosinska, Patty Green, and David Anderson for all of their efforts to organize this workshop. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We hope you'll keep working with us as we continue to address issues related to advancing real world data and real world evidence. Hope to see you soon and stay well.